All right, it's my pleasure to be joined today on Bad Faith for the first time by Professor Anita Say Chan, who is a professor of information sciences and media studies at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign. Welcome to Bad Faith Podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Now, principally, you are the author, for our purposes today anyway, you're the author of this book, Predatory Data, Eugenics in Big Tech and Our Fight for an Independent Future. And it struck me as very timely to have you on to talk about this precisely because of how, in the foreground, the influence of huge tech voices are in our contemporary political moment. And the fact that Elon Musk, as the biggest of those voices, also happens to own the platform that is probably the most fundamental primary platform for journalists at the time, has become really powerful in amplifying certain really distinct narratives that, as you explain in your book, echo really meaningfully to with eugenics movements of the past. So how about we start by you kind of laying out the case that you make in this book for why it's important for us to understand these eugenics movements of the past to properly contextualize our contemporary moment.
Super. Yeah, thanks for that question, Brianna. We often forget that datification did not start, 10 or 20 years ago. However, we sort of mark the sort of beginning of the age of big data. That the age of datification really began much earlier than that, and that the first global movement for datification, and one could also say the first global movement for disinformation, started well over a century ago with a whole network of researchers, eugenicists, who were pushing essentially for the datification of populations at scale, essentially in order to create more predictive methods, what they believe would lead to more predictive methods for the perfection and social engineering of human society under a kind of explicitly white supremacist and Western supremacist model. They believe that the datification of populations could lead scientists to be able to predict what degeneracy, which populations were more likely to have degeneracy, which populations would be able to articulate that into a version of social cost. But essentially datifying populations and by applying their kinds of predictive methods, they would be able to execute a kind of more perfected mode of society that would be more efficient, and lead to a kind of eugenic utopia. All of this led to as well a kind of whole proliferation of various datification techniques in the late 19th century. Everything from IQ tests to border controls to biometric identification systems, photographic identification systems, criminal databases. All of this is owed in the 19th century and were very heavily pushed by early eugenicists, who also were very, very successful at also winning a whole range of different policy gains. And so this from the first sterilization laws in the US that were eventually applied in over 30 states, again, to prevent the sort of proliferation of supposedly degenerate populations, and supposedly contaminating the gene pool of the nation and leading to a weaker nation. um, to the first immigration bans, to immigration quotas, all of these infamous gains of the 19th century around immigration exclusion acts, from, again, the late 1870s onward into the 1917 and 1924 immigration acts, were all due to eugenic lobbying. We forget that the kind of political wave that we're seeing now in terms of that, the leaders of datification contemporarily, their eyes on politics and on policy. This is nothing new. This trend started over a century ago. And again, we're starting to, again, to see that sort of gains made in the halls of Washington. Yeah, really just carrying on a tradition that we've seen before.
So I want to make sure that we're all on the same page with respect to certain terms. You've mentioned datification a bunch of times, and people can probably pick up from context clues some of the examples of that which you included. But I'd love for you to just stay there for a second and help people to understand why you would apply a specific term for what might be perceived by the kind of lay ear as, hey, these are just technological innovations. What is so bad? I mean, we invent new ways to have, metrics to keep track of populations. People might be thinking of, census information as important to assess the relative well-being of various populations and to guard against discriminatory effects on various populations, who might see something like biometrics or fingerprinting or, photographic data as important to various public interest goals, like, let's say, solving crime, et cetera, might see something like an IQ test as a net neutral. So I might provide some context for why these kinds of technologies, this datification, was applied. What's the kind of political context that was
Absolutely.
driving that? Yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, I think as we've seen contemporarily, data is very, very related to infrastructures of power. Data, in fact, does not operate neutrally, and there have been any number of different scholars and voices. And also, I think we're sort of witnessing as well the way that data operates in a very non-neutral way, and that it's a question of who gets to control and determine what those data infrastructures look like. That can very much determine different forms of outcomes. It's precisely why the New York Times does not look like the front page of X or Twitter. That again, the way that we think about data is neutral. Data is an index of maybe some version of the empirical world. One hopes, but how that ends up getting filtered, and the means by which it's used to sort of bolster various sorts of projections of futures can look very different, obviously. The means by which that data, I mean, the kind of, I make a nod to the eugenics movement because it's a very, of the late 19th century, because it's a very sort of explicit mode or model for thinking about and for recognizing how the sort of drive and the obsession with collecting data at scale was very much one that was driven by obsessions around the kind of potential degeneration of an elite population and a kind of Western elite patrician class that was quite worried looking at what was happening in the late 19th century, a huge wave of independence movements, the context of new forms of globalization that were impacting Western immigration patterns, the kind of rise of urbanization that enabled a kind of mixing in cities that elites had not seen before. And a proximity of various classes that drove their own kinds of existential anxieties. All of that was very much behind a kind of new obsession for them as well, to sort of think through, how do we end up protecting our own classes? How do we end up maintaining a sort of strength of national fortitude by essentially creating a program to maintain the sort of supremacy of those classes, precisely in the context of new mingling and mixing and pluralism that we had never seen before. Francis Galton, who is the father, known as 19th century founder of eugenics, the biostatistician who had come up with the use of the term eugenics in the late 19th century, was quite famous for one of his earliest publications around eugenics before he had even come up with the term, from the 1860s, where he was was termed around the notion of his sort of ability to try and start to predict natural genius. It's a term that we might have heard quite recently with Donald Trump, sort of now making attacks on DEIA policy and supposedly trying to back the hiring of the more merit-based hiring of government employees, and saying that we should have hallways filled with natural geniuses instead. All of this is explicitly a nod back to early eugenic language. And the notion that Francis Galton had introduced then was that there would be a correlation between the sort of the patrician families and the kind of more likely occurrence for natural genius and talents. And he was obsessed with trying to datify this initially by just looking at the sort of encyclopedias of who's from the 19th century, looking at sort of families of Western elites, and trying to assure his publics that there was ample data, as he would say, that genius amongst the families of the elite were more highly occurring, and that you could also therefore, in his extrapolation, prove the counterpart, that degeneracy, criminality, alcoholism, pauperism were more likely to occur amongst the poor precisely because of genetic tendencies. That this was something that again, was biologically determined and driven, and that therefore it should be entirely predictable for us to be able to enumerate where criminality would occur, where pauperism would occur, and therefore start to put a halt on the kinds of social policies that essentially were trying to, as eugenicists thought about it in their day, waste public monies on essentially trying to re-engineer society around some version of equality. From their point of view, society should be instead engineered precisely around the most gifted, the most talented, and execute that kind of hierarchy in order to create the strongest nations. And that democratic policies, welfare policies, were anathema to the kind of to strengthening the nation, and they were really indignant that one would ever even think of again wasting resources, not just wasting resources on the poor, but essentially taking resources away from the elite, keeping investments from going back to them. And so you saw Galton, even in his earliest publications, starting to lean into those arguments that the kinds of models that he was using should be implemented and taken up by national policymakers, especially in the US.
I want to pause you right there because I think that is such an important point. I think that discussions of racism, prejudice are sometimes done a disservice by not sufficiently underlying the sort of economic upside for those people who adopt these theories and promulgate them in their own self-interest. I think whether or not it's true, I happen to, I have my own feelings, but whether or not you sort of, there's a lot of resistance, shall we say, in part because of Elon Musk and our contemporary political environment to the idea that, racism persists, or that, it's being framed as this sort of like random evil in the spirits of children that leftists want to project onto, white people, and that's inherently even all these things. But what I think it's really important to underscore is the extent to which there is an elite class, a wealthy, affluent class, at a time in history where you're having, it's like at the end of the colonial period, you have the Haitian Revolution, you have the American Civil War, you have radical shifts in geopolitics that are imperiling the dominant few, the people who have been historically dominant. And as a consequence, and simultaneously, this is the other part was fascinating, I wanted to pick up on. The other part is that historically, you write, there was no need to provide a sort of moral rationale for poverty because there was scarcity. So to the extent that there were poor people, it was framed as, well, that's just the way the world is. There isn't enough to go around. And there's no real threat to the majority. When you get to a point where, because of technological advances and science and all of the like, there is less scarcity, you can provide food, healthcare, whatever it is, electricity, plumbing, clothes, to the general population, and there is a refusal to do so, aka poverty is a policy choice. You suddenly have to then justify your choice not to do so by making claims about the bottom tranche of our society.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. There was the notion of the undeserving poor, and this again, this underscoring of who merited public investments, and in fact, who merited rights which was one of the kind of fundamental arguments of eugenicists, was something that they sort of started to introduce and experiment with and really tried to popularize, and were quite successful, of course, in doing so when you look at the kinds of policy gains that were achieved in the US by the early 20th century. I mean, when you think about what forced sterilization laws and exclusion laws were really about, it was about essentially denying rights and creating a stratification for who was deserving of certain rights and who wasn't, and the notion that unfit populations the poor, people who had been institutionalized in one way or another, who were at fault or had somehow demonstrated, according to eugenicists, their own sort of their own degeneracy, their own kind of unfitness, and their own unworthiness for being a kind of an investment in someone who should be able to kind of bear the fruits of rights. All of that, I mean, all of those gains were very much ones that were pro a kind of segregationist and a stratification argument that, again, created pools of the population around not this notion of shared equality and shared rights, but instead, I mean, again, the sort of tenet of what we even think about in terms of citizenship, right? A sort of notion of at least some version of commonness, but instead starting to, again, stratify quite radically the notion of who it was that deserves certain kinds of rights, and that extending those rights to especially the unfit, whether it was populations that were underproductive, that were immigrant classes that were thought of at the time as correlating to poverty, criminality, alcoholism, even political dissent. There were all of those things translated into new policy gains for eugenicists, where they were essentially able to, again, argue that our immigration policy should be based on this notion of exercising some kind of filter for deciding who were the meriting populations and who were not. And so what we saw in the 1917 and 1924 Immigration Acts were essentially a kind of pooling of populations, a privileging of Nordic races, that were thought to have a kind of, again, larger proclivity for intelligence, for productivity, for economic and physical strength, for even moral strength, and a deprivileging and quotas being executed to explicitly decrease the number of immigrants coming in from Southern Europe, from obviously Africa and Latin America, and that essentially cut off all immigration from Asia until almost in the 1950s. Again, with the thought being that those populations, and the argument being that those populations demonstrated higher proclivities to criminality, to alcoholism, to pauperism, but also political dissent. And so we oftentimes forget how broadly that notion of underfitness was actually argued to be. And that eugenicists by eugenic frameworks that were active in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, and that eugenicists were actively, especially under organizations in the US like the Eugenics Research Organization, the American Breeders Association. There are a number of other associations as well in California and in the Midwest.
Breeders Association is rough.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's quite, yeah. I mean, they were using their early models. Their earliest models were around thinking, if we can pedigree horses, why can we not do that as well to humankind? I mean, really literally thinking, and again, I think, Brianna, your question around what is the psychology that allows that? What is the sort of closed culture of self-righteousness, of conceit that allows that sort of bubbled form, that sort of insular form of reality that is deeply, deeply not just prejudicious, but paranoid to a point of existential risk of the other? What does that look like in order to be able to execute the kinds of deadly policies, right? I mean, again, when you're thinking about what sterilization laws really were, the kind of deadly policies that were popularized across the US, and to execute this as as a mantra, as a mission. Eugenics was taught in over 400 colleges and universities in the US by the early 20th century. I mean, it was not something that was just a kind of pseudoscience that was a fad or just on the fringes of conversation. It was something that was well taken up by a particular kind of elite that was promulgated, that was attempted to be scaled out through various knowledge institutions, and that, of course, as the book underscores, also had very explicitly politics as their kind of center space for gain, where you really saw a kind of conversation or a kind of reorientation of science specifically towards the realm of politics as a place to try and execute some version of reengineering. We oftentimes think of science and scientists as, and researchers as folks who are sort of politically naive, or just, they sort of want to do their own thing and stay in their own little cloister and in their lane. This was a movement that was very, very explicit that it wanted to have and needed to organize itself around gaining political footholds and advocacy towards policymakers. And they constituted their own data techniques very much in the likeness of effective communication to politicians, to a political elite, and as the book also gets into eventually as well, to a more popular class, because they were well aware that in order to really sort of execute their imaginary and their mission for a kind of eugenic reengineering of society, it wouldn't take only the elite. It would take some version of popular classes as well, who could identify with a white supremacist agenda and a Western supremacist agenda, and in order to, again, scale out the program.
And it worked. The scaling up worked. One of the points that you make in this book is that it was so popular. You alluded to how many universities had eugenics programs, how mainstream this really was, and that the pushback came in the form of basically Nazis making it unpopular, right? That we were escalating and everyone was happy-go-lucky with this eugenics movement until Adolf Hitler says, oh yes, I'm very, very fond of these American eugenicists whose research is the basis of my mass genocide project. And suddenly when you're fighting a world war over this subject, it's a little less appealing to be on the same side as Hitler. But what sorry, go ahead. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you.
No, all just to say that it could essentially maintain a mantra of being a kind of scientific movement that was based on some sort of evidence, and that was very happy. I mean, what you would see in the decades leading up to the 1930s, right, the sort of like growth and golden age of eugenics was really a kind of popularization of it, and you would see eugenics and well-known eugenic advocates and leaders, Madison Grant on the front page of the New York Times, having Madison Grant himself, an author of a best-selling eugenic text, not the only one of its day, but one that went through 15 different editions by a major publisher, Scribner's, setting off another kind of golden age as well of eugenic publishing. Again, as I was mentioning, he was not the only eugenic author. In fact, there were any number of them, dozens that were publishing, and Scribner's and other publishers of the day also looking for, recognizing how much of an appetite this could trigger amongst an American reading public and an international reading public. This is around the 1910s. When this was all, when the passing of The Great Race, Madison Grant's best-selling eugenic publication was coming out.
Was that the one that sold 400,000 copies, or was that Sir Francis Galt?
Yeah. Oh, Sir Francis
400,000 copies, even today, would be enormous. Who knows? I don't have any sense of what the population of America was in 1920.
Yes. Yeah.
But that's incredible. That's Daniel Steele numbers, that's E.L. Gray numbers.
No, absolutely. Exactly. This is exactly why this was absolutely a kind of heyday for eugenic disinformation. It was something that triggered the appetites of a reading public, precisely because it was based on a kind of fear and anxiety kind of messaging, that there was an existential threat to good white families, which was the kind of bottom line, that the threat was being scaled out by democratic policy and policymakers who are allowing these waves of darker, shorter, less intelligent classes to come in and contaminate the gene pool. Supposedly, the evidence for that was already the kind of the sort of what you could see happening in cities. In other words, poverty in cities, a kind of clustering or heightened populations that you would see in certain kinds of neighborhoods. All of this was supposedly true evidence of the kind of truth of a eugenic underscoring that these populations were overly inclined to criminality, poverty, alcoholism. I mean, and in the case of the Chinese, which was the first population that was really sort of organized around for eugenic exclusion laws and immigration bans, that they were bringing in contaminating health diseases, syphilis, venereal diseases. There were any number of health reports that were being published at the time that was based on the hypersurveillance of Chinese populations, essentially to argue that especially Chinese women who were all prostitutes were culpable, were responsible for the heightened rates of venereal diseases and syphilis that white families were contracting, with testimony from medical professionals and from public health officials of the day, supposedly tracking 80 to 90% of venereal diseases. In other words, almost all that version of disease within the white male population of cities in California, like San Francisco, essentially tracking that to Chinese prostitutes and to Chinese women. This is where the first Exclusion Act of the United States that we saw, the Page Act of 1875, came into place. There is, of course, when you track and you remember that the 1875's Page Act was one that excluded Chinese women based on supposedly the risk that they posed to heteronormative, good, healthy white families of the day, that it sort of upends much of what had become a kind of common framework for thinking that anti-immigration laws and bans were put into place, especially the Chinese exclusion laws were put into place supposedly because of labor competition. Again, when you look at what was going on and the kind of record of who the first targeted populations were and what that sort of exclusion was based on, you can see immediately that it was not about labor competition. There was not competition that white politicians were concerned about in terms of a market for sex workers. It was really about the notion of the kind of again, the risk that they were posing, the supposed hyped up risk that they were posing to good heteronormative white families.
I want to this is a really interesting, I think, moment to come back to this point about datification. My early question about the kind of politics behind this kind of superficially neutral counting and accounting of people and populations and metrics. Sorry. There is, in this example, it is the selective observation of this West Coast Chinese population that is done with the effort, somewhat unsuccessfully so, in tying them to the spread of venereal disease or, prostitution or whatever it is. And it's the selective kind of monitoring that ultimately I think is where the perniciousness lies in. And I want to invite you to talk a little bit about how this went down on Ellis Island. You tell a really compelling anecdote about the interview questions that were offered to incoming immigrants that were supposed to get a sense of how degenerate or intellectually deficient various groups were, that were only selectively applied to the steerage class and not even to the first class passengers to begin with.
Exactly. Yeah. No, those are, thank you for pointing. That chapter is one in part that sort of sets off a kind of framework around reminding us that these sorts of obsessions that we're seeing coming out of Silicon Valley around intelligence and IQ tests and supposedly maintaining a kind of a cognitive elite and wanting to model ourselves around the kind of cognitive elite, the kind of worry that you see, the pro-natalist and frankly eugenic kinds of worries that you see coming out of people, literally Elon Musk making references to civilization will fall unless we, that is the elites of Silicon Valley and specifically his own employees, don't start having more babies.
No, we have an underpopulation problem.
Really?
Yeah.
Why do you
So
say that?
this is the most commonly misunderstood situation.
Yeah, they definitely push that we have a
Mhm.
overpopulation.
Yeah, why is
problem.
that?
I don't know. It's just like, I think it's like, this is a holdover from like, I don't know, the 70s or something, you know? So there was a huge baby boom, like where people did have a ton of kids after World War II. But then the US has actually the birth rate in the US has been below replacement rate since like 71 or 72.
In the US,
like
but
50
how
years.
about
50
other
years, the US has
countries,
been
though?
below replacement rate.
I know US, but how about other countries?
Well, like China's got a huge population collapse problem.
Really?
Yeah.
China, you actually get penalized if you have more than one
Oh.
kid.
No,
Yeah.
see
you
it-
being serious?
No,
Oh,
no,
I
So
like
they
that,
cut
like
that
that.
off.
no, see, this is like, so part of it is just like we're operating on things that were true in the past but are no longer true. So China did have a one-child policy, but like about 10 years ago, they changed it to a two-child policy. And then a few years ago, they changed it to a three-child policy. And birth rate kept plummeting the whole time. So they had the lowest birth rate ever last year.
Well,
Really?
Yeah, China's birth rate right now is 40% below replacement.
Wow, traditional women. I don't want to, like, you know.
Listen, one can speculate as to the reasons, but I
I mean,
can tell you
there's
that
no hoes. I mean, like,
Andrew Tate was last week, bro.
I know, but it's true, bro. Like what you said about birth, I
They're out there.
see that.
Wow, that is a very common misconception. I would have
it's
never.
a very common
might be
yeah.
right.
misconception. Like,
Yeah.
what we face is population collapse.
Huh.
Collapse. Like people have no idea how fast the population is going to collapse.
What are we trending
Japan
at?
is pretty far along in that. Like Japan actually lost like 600,000, went down by 600,000 people last year.
The Japanese are not in the bedroom at all. Then
It would
Not at
seem,
all.
It would seem not.
What about the U.S.? We got to increase, right?
Yeah, what I'm saying is the U.S. has been below replacement rate for 50 years. The only
That's
reason
so
the
nuts.
population has increased is
Like
because-
yearly, you're
since
saying.
the 70s.
Yeah, since the early 70s, since like 71, 72.
So why are we spewed with all this BS that we're overpopulating, but the population's growing, right?
No, it's not. So I mean, I should say the like lifespan is increasing.
Mhm.
People are living longer. That's the only reason why the population of Earth isn't plummeting, but it will plummet. So, just like one metric to track is the ratio of adult diapers to baby diapers.
Mhm.
Like, at what point does a country have more adult diapers than baby diapers? And like Japan went past that point over 10 years ago, I believe.
Whoa.
What do you think happens in like the future then? What's your kind of thought on that?
Well, I think we've got to turn this around. We've got to have at least replacement rate, if not more, on the baby front. And by the way, these are not matters that are subjective. You can just literally look at the birth rate.
Yeah.
You know, it's like it's an objective number. Like how many babies were born. It's like they recorded this information. You know, so
So you're saying people need to be having more kids?
yeah.
Right, this kind of framework of trying to connect the notion and this kind of risk to the generation of the population based on non-smart families or the non-cognitive elite not having more children. All of this is sort of an obsession that started, of course, with eugenicists. Datification around intelligence was one of the things that American eugenicists were huge pushers of. It's important to remember that the first kinds of IQ tests that were being developed in the early 20th century are often credited to a French scientist, psychologist, Alfred Binet, who was very explicit that the kinds of tests and the metrics that he was developing should never be used to create hierarchies amongst individuals who were tested. And in his case, it was largely being applied to still children in public institutions in France. He was very explicit that if anything, the test should only be used to sort of gauge a child against themselves. In other words, to sort of track progress or not progress, et cetera, rather than to try and create some sort of hard high numeric hierarchy. And he was very explicit that he was quite worried about the kinds of abuses that would happen from public institution officials or any officials who were applying the test, where they start to use it in the kind of realm of sort of trying to metrify through a hard number what someone's sort of internal value of intelligence would be, and what the kinds of further outcomes of that could look like. Henry Gardner, the U.S. psychologist and education institutional head who had in the U.S. who had picked up on Binet's test and translated them into English for use in American institutions, had no such concerns. He was he was a eugenicist of his day, and immediately recognized the potential in being able to metricize IQ and to use that, essentially to use and gear these tests towards a version of being able to, again, filter populations according to versions of fitness, to sort of recognize which children or which individuals, because he ended up applying the test or arguing the test could be applied to well beyond just children, but which individuals should be better receiving of state benefits and which ones not. He was one of the first. He was the psychologist, the educational psychologist in the U.S. who was credited with introducing the term moron into medical lexicon to try and create a stratification of the feeble-minded. And by the 1910s, he was arguing that we should be using these IQ tests, his translated IQ tests, to essentially filter immigrants, to decide which ones were worthy of entrance into Ellis Island through our various ports. But by 1913, had started doing tests or trying to apply his test to prove, again, the kind of intellectual degeneracy of especially the poorest immigrants that were coming in through Ellis Island. As you mentioned, he himself essentially designed the application of his test to get the results that he was looking for. So he was looking for heightened numbers in order to, again, prove illiteracy and what he would argue was feeble-mindedness amongst the poorest immigrants who were coming in Ellis Island. So that's why he targeted the immigrants who were coming in steward class, which was the sort of lowest cost class that someone could travel into through port. And he applied his test then, essentially, again, his translated test, where he would introduce questions that were explicitly designed for failure. So would ask immigrants who were coming in, what is Crisco? Who is Christy Mathewson? Crisco was an American cooking product that had only been just introduced in the U.S. several years earlier. Christy Mathewson was a U.S. American football player who one would wonder why would and what would be the means by which anyone coming in would even be able to pay attention.
If you don't know who Jalen Hurts is, you're a moron.
Exactly. And in English, exactly. And applying the test too in English. And so
only, by the way, only to a subset of the people on the ship. So obviously, if you start asking these very difficult to answer for a lot of people for a lot of reasons questions to the rich class, you would have a counter case that would undermine your whole thesis, right? So that's so key to the stratification point.
Precisely. The results of his study were being published on the front page of the New York Times. Again, as I was mentioning, eugenicists were not thought of as anathema. They were thought of as vanguard scientists of their day, and you could find any number of them mentioned, written about, celebrated, and enthused over in articles in any number of respectable liberal publications. David Starr Jordan, the founding president of Stanford University, Oliver Wendell Holmes, the dean of Harvard Medical School, Oliver Wendell Holmes,
famously
Jr.
of the opinion, 3 generations of imbeciles is enough.
Exactly. The junior who ended up becoming a Supreme Court judge, who presided over the famous case that essentially reinstituted and asserted the legal basis for forced sterilization of the unfit, arguing in the Carrie Buck case essentially that 3 generations, exactly as you quoted, Brianna, of imbeciles is enough. All of them were, of course, in the highest statures and spaces and institutions of American literary life, political life, social life. As I mentioned, this was really a kind of movement that it was initiated with the elite, with the patrician and lettered classes, quite worried about their own sort of existential futures.
Yeah,
and really sort of,
that's so
again, thinking through.
important. And I don't want to skirt by this point that you made just a few moments ago about the justification for categorizing sections, subsets of the population as inherently, intrinsically, and immutably deficient is to no longer have to do social spending on them. So if you are a person who, perhaps because of your ideological priors, does not believe in social spending, does not believe in a social safety net, does not believe in upward mobility because you're at the top, and why would you want that competition? Because you want a depressed labor class to exploit. For all of these reasons, of course, there is an obvious political relationship between this so-called science, the pseudoscience, and your personal economic project. And I don't want that to go unmissed as we consider why these arguments are being redeployed, frankly, very effectively today. I want to get into that in more detail, but I don't also want to sidestep. We've mentioned sterilization a few times. As a history of science major who took history of medicine classes, I am very familiar with this history. But I do think that sometimes the average person doesn't actually understand how bad this stuff was, the scale of it. Tens of thousands of people in America sterilized. What was it? 1/3 of the population of Puerto Rico sterilized?
That's right. Exactly. Yes, exactly. And that sterilization laws in some states, I mean, it took years for sterilization laws to become ineffective or overturned, and that in many spaces like Puerto Rico, sterilization laws went well into the late 20th century. Absolutely.
Yeah, and this other point before we get into some of this contemporary politics stuff more, there are the perception that this is science. The perception, okay, most people, although a growing number of people no longer feel this way, but most people understand eugenics bad. You watch Gattaca, you get the point of it. You're rooting for the ungenetically modified guy. Hitler bad, again, increasingly not the case, but still majorities believe Hitler bad. But that being the case, people who understand eugenics bad still might buy into the utility and value of, let's say, an IQ test, and might perceive some of these arguments around IQ and merit as, well, merit is good though, actually. And maybe some populations on the whole can't compete. And these metrics themselves aren't the problem. If I believe that IQ tests are real and good, but also don't think there should be any policy changes behind it, is that a bad thing per se? And I do worry about the need to really clarify that the tests themselves, as you explained in the example of the Ellis Island questionnaire, are designed to get the results that they want, that the designer of the IQ test himself did not want it to be applied beyond the discrete use to decide what children needed additional attention in a school setting because of the inherent failings of that test itself. And that this extends well beyond IQ tests you mentioned, or maybe I remember this example, I think, from college, of the fingerprinting. And how fingerprinting, as I recall correctly, please correct me, it's been 20 years, Professor, but fingerprinting was adapted in India precisely because of this combination of British colonists feeling that they couldn't tell Indian people apart, and that they believed Indians had an inherent immorality, that a predisposition to crime and dishonesty and theft.
Precisely, yes.
And therefore needed to be tracked. And how so many of our tracking technologies it was considered to be inappropriate at first to even apply them to white people.
Yes.
Because it was so stigmatizing.
Precisely.
And diminishing.
Yes. Yeah. Yes. I mean, you're sort of, we forget that we think of these ideas as really quite absurd nowadays, but they were quite serious in their days. Our entire photographic, I love your nod to the Indian identification system under colonization. And we had very, very parallel moves that were obviously also happening in the US that were tied immediately to the Immigration Exclusion Acts that I was mentioning in the 19th century that eugenicists had effectively argued for. Our passports, the kind of notion of passports as a visual control, all of that the earliest experiments with that, or the earliest applications of that, started with the Chinese, and they were not universally applied. They were applied very specifically to the Chinese initially because there was also this notion, precisely very, very much in kind of line with colonial anxieties, or with, in this case, nativist anxieties, with a notion of this population as, again, being a kind of more inclined to criminality, of trying to sort of skirt the system, of getting around and under the system, of their wily methods, managing to sort of circumvent either U.S. immigration law or U.S. Labor laws. And so this notion of having to not just have a kind of photographic documentation, so that when someone entered the port, they were forced to be able to demonstrate that they were who they were, right? So again, this sort of attempt for biometric control. At a time, we should keep in mind where it was not obviously being able to have access to some version of photographic self-documentation was not something that was easy to acquire, and again was another form of a version of a filter. At the time, there was also a kind of an attempt to sort of morally document passengers who were coming in, Chinese women explicitly first, and then also applied to the Chinese population in order, again, to have a kind of moral documentation and valence and metric, where they needed to sort of prove and demonstrate who sponsors were, where they were coming from, who their family was, and essentially being able to sort of attest to good moral standing in written documentation, again, before it was applied at all in any version, in any kind of further version of sort of literacy tests as a means to kind of metricize moral worth.
Yes, and the metricization, the use of what were at the time new technologies, and we're talking about the photograph. I mean, the photography was invented in like 1839, if I remember.
Yeah. Oh.
So I wrote my thesis on not exactly on this.
I love this, Rihanna. This is great.
But I was in the history and science part with Peter Theil and all of them. So
yes,
I wrote about the anatomical atlas and why, despite this push at the time to kind of technological, make everything seem objective and empirical through the use of new technologies, anatomical atlases seem to resist that trend and were drawn throughout the period. That was the subject of my thesis. But the broader point that I'm trying to make is that the fact of these technologies, including photography, which now we think of more as like art, help to make what had up until that point been value neutral, like kind of not value neutral, like subjective opinions or fields that were not taken very seriously because of the subjectivity inherent to them, like psychology. People were trying to make it seem more empirical and objective by applying these forms with these technologies, which seem to index the truth. So now instead of me just saying these people are morons or mentally inferior in some way, I can take a bunch of pictures of people in a row and say, these are the features that capture what an idiot looks like. These are the features that capture what a criminal looks like. This is a fingerprint. This is, and it makes it seem like real science in a way that it didn't before. And objective, and not just I'm a racist or whatever. But look, you can't deny what your eyes are telling you with this photograph, with this scientific instrument is conveying.
Precisely. This is a sort of the kind of, I would say, tactic of and strategy of eugenicists over and over again, that through some version of datification, they could constantly sort of lean back on the notion that they weren't doing politics. They were just doing something evidentiary. Their work was just research-based. The kind of, when they blew up the kinds of maps of Madison Grant in the hallways of Congress in the weeks preceding the passage of the 1917 Immigration Exclusion Acts, right, saying that these maps will demonstrate a version of the kind of degeneration that we'll see happen in the U.S. to U.S. populations if we sort of allow ourselves to get flooded by this sort of waves of unfit immigrants, right? All of that was, again, supposedly based on some version of the effective use of data, again, to demonstrate, to supposedly underscore that this was not about them lobbying for power. This is just them essentially showing a kind of map for the future that was research-based, that was based in a kind of real indexing of of society around us. The one other part to your kind of notion of who was getting datafied that you were just describing, Brianna, that I wanted to underscore was that although I mean it's imperative that we remember, and that we kind of build this connection, and that eugenicists allow us to see this connection between the hyper-datification and the hyper-surveillance that we're seeing, especially of vulnerable populations, underserved populations, minority populations today, and the kind of outsized harm, damage, dispossession, violence, consequence on life and death that we're seeing happening disproportionately to overly monitored and surveilled populations today. Again, we see that all start with the eugenicists and eugenic movements from over 100 years ago, with their kind of focus on datification of the unfit, essentially to kind of prove, again, that you could correlate, that there were these correlations between specific populations, the poor, etc., Black and brown populations, immigrant populations, disabled populations, and other forms of more hidden unfitness, low IQ, hidden criminal tendencies, hidden tendencies that you couldn't see with your own eyes, to alcoholism and underproductivity, and even to future descent, right? This is what their program was. We can give you a program for predicting and designing the future, and to keep yourselves from having to spend unnecessarily good public monies on undeserving populations. This was their promise, right? Right, exactly. But I want to just underscore very, very quickly that it wasn't just at the end, in the beginning and at the end as well. I mean, it wasn't just unfit populations who eugenicists argued needed to be datified. They wanted to datify themselves, and this started. I mean, I mentioned Francis Galton, a really interesting case study and portrait. If you want to sort of look and see where the roots of tech broism comes from, absolutely a version of just self-endowed, hyper-surveilling inventor of datification technologies who would use secret and invisible counters, handheld counters in his pocket, to surveil women in neighborhoods across London, insistent that he would be able to create a real beauty map of London that would correlate, of course, the good neighborhoods with higher propensities to beauty and bad neighborhoods.
He's just like Mark Zuckerberg.
Absolutely.
That was the original Facebook, hot or not.
Absolutely. But Galton was also somebody who, again, was very keen on, and again, datifying the kind of, and trying to prove the worth of the fit, right? I mean, like his initial experiments of like, let's just sort of datify the kind of who's and prove that there is more worth in the kinds of sons and daughters, so sons really, I mean, when you're looking at the who's of elite families, and that we can prove natural talent, and that talent and genius have higher propensities in these already literary, well-endowed, elite patrician families, right? That was he's essentially sort of giving you insight to his own anxieties around the non-basis, in fact, of his own sort of elite status and privilege. And the kinds of things that he was doing, I mean, all of his experiments, leading up to his eventual, he was endowed with an anthropometric lab at University College London. I mean, again, just to underscore, these were not sort of fringe quack experimenters operating in the shadows of research communities. They were front and center, and ones who were enabled, whose agenda for eugenic reengineering was well enabled by other institutions of power around them. But some of the things that he was doing leading up to the building out of his eugenic or his anthropometric lab at University College London was building out at public exhibits and public fairs in London his own sort of anthropometric lab architecture, where he would essentially apply his new datification technologies to any members of the public who are willing to sort of self-datify and who are interested in getting their own kind of data profile around things like strength of blow, acuity of vision, strength of grip, all of these things that none of us think of as sort of in any way correlate, right, exactly, to any version of like, he was convinced that the kind of that there was a correlation between physical fitness, moral fitness, and intelligence, right? Mental fitness, that all of these things could get clustered together. And there were
This is again
thousands of
sounding
people.
very much like what's going on with the overlap between these tech bros and this like life sustaining. There's the guy who keeps injecting his son's blood.
Yeah.
It's combined with this kind of what used to be kind of left coded woo woo health and fitness, self maximizing, life maxing model.
Exactly. These guys really operate in their kind of closed world bubble, and again, where they're kinds of there are two parts of it. One where there's sort of an image where, of course, their notion and entitlement to experimentation knows no bounds, right? So when we see an internet that now is essentially, and social media platforms that are essentially built and constructed as the world's largest experimentation platform. These are the largest platforms for experimentation with human publics at scale, with essentially no bars. And where over and over again, the leaders of tech companies have refused and lobbied against any version of even light regulation to maintain any version of accountability to their version of experimentation that at any other university, much lower bars.
Experimentation do you mean? Because I remember some years ago when the Harvard guys that founded OkCupid had done that study on kind of racial preferences on the app, and they released it. And there was some backlash because of the results of the study, but then there was some backlash about them having done it at all. And I remember thinking at the time, I'm like, I'm glad we have this information. I'm happy the study happened. So are you kind of pushing back against the idea that they should be doing these experiments at all? That one, obviously, there's, no one's going to be really hurt by that. But or the idea, when you say there should be regulation, I wonder what you mean by that. Because there are a lot of people, I think, in this audience who are, as much as they might dislike Elon Musk and his politics, they also don't like the extent to which the U.S. government and its own surveillance apparatus has tried to do its own moderation and censorship on these apps that has nothing to do with like the greater public interest. And neither Elon's censorship nor the government's censorship are transparent or trusted. And that they'd rather have maybe laissez-faire than like more untransparent regulation.
I would say that there's a number of different conversations that are happening around thinking around like what kind of model would we actually have a safer if we thought about social media platforms and online communication technologies in the same way that we might think about other forms of sort of public public infrastructures, whether it's transportation or medicine. I mean, where there's some sort of baseline for public safety that we could expect, especially when we're talking about the youngest members of our family, the oldest members of our family, the most intimate versions of our lives, really sort of being trafficked across this space, right? That we should at least have some version of baseline safety. Even tech companies themselves, right? I mean, the notion that they would have set up different sorts of safety boards and office and teams, very underfunded and very undersized, but gives you a sense of at least some version of like minimal, that there should be, even from their point of view, once upon a time, a kind of minimal expectation for safety. All of those things, of course, are now being eroded. Safety teams.
So by safety, you mean like end-to-end encryption style safety, or like what you talk about in, I think, your first chapter, where it's like pointing out how all of the content regulation that does exist is concentrated overwhelmingly in the United States, even though there's like we constitute like 10% of all of Facebook's traffic as compared to like India, which is like a third of all of the traffic or something.
That's right. Yeah. Much of the safety teams, I would say, as they were operating within social media, in the space of social media, were really focused on sort of disinformation in the US. That was the kind of large framework of like disinformation that would have any kind of version of like
negatively stigmatized. Like, right. This is part of the problem. Like, I'm compelled by the reality that there is obviously within these tech companies, whatever their politics are, even if they're right coded, still a belief that for their own benefit, there needs to be content moderation so that the apps aren't unusable, so that it's not all porn and go kill yourself.
Right.
So like, but I just want to flag, I have to flag, because I know that people in the audience's ears are going to perk up, that there's this other part of it that was, you know, political administrations saying, don't share information about lab leak theory, for instance, which just this past week or two, the CIA finally comes around to saying, yeah, totes my goats, it was lab leak theory. And feeling like that sort of suppression, that kind of moderation, that kind of misinformation monitoring is people are very suspicious of. The word misinformation is like very stigmatized right now as a consequence of that sort of behavior.
Sure. Yeah. Right. But at the same time, I mean, you can obviously see that there can be real consequences when you, I mean, open up the book to sort of demonstrate that this notion that we don't know what's going to happen when we take out content moderation, we can already see what's happened in any number of different contexts, especially globally, because this experiment, and as I say, these are platforms for experimentation on publics. These are not, and where by this point now, we see some of the consequences of that, and they are not unknowns.
Can you talk about what happened in India?
So precisely in the context of the largest democracy on the world, in India, we have had a design disinvestment in safety and content moderation, such that on any number of Facebooks, which is one of the kinds of main ways that publics in India are able to access the internet and social media messaging. A kind of rise of disinformation and explosion of disinformation have been coming up since, by the mid 2010s. Varied nonprofits, NGO workers, human rights organizations were sort of calling out what they noticed was a real spike, not just in disinformation that targeted minoritized populations, especially Muslim minoritized populations, Dalit minoritized populations, but that actually translated into some version of mob violence against supposed sightings of things like there is such and such unknown stranger that's coming into the area, and it looks like they are here to do some version of conversion of our Muslim village, steal wives, kidnap children, etc. The victims of this, you could see even on the front pages of the Washington Post and the New York Times reported some of the kinds of results of this that were happening that were startling to many sort of global readers, English language readers of the liberal press, reading about this sort of escalation of mob violence that was happening in site after site across in province after province across India, but that nonprofit workers, local human rights organizations, local organizers had been calling out for a while, because some of the victims had been everyone as young as 12-year-old boys to Google workers themselves, again, sort of being targeted for being a sort of unknown entity that looks suspicious, and were suddenly a kind of rapid relay of messaging across social media platforms, WhatsApp, Instagram, Facebook, would suddenly lead to some version of uncontrolled violence. And what could you end up doing? Who could you hold accountable at that point? Even Facebook workers themselves, when they were doing studies on the impacts of their platform around the 2010s, and we saw some of this get leaked out with the Frances Haugen papers, that Facebook workers themselves were aghast and were reporting back up to leadership channels that what the impacts of disinformation were in terms of bloodied violence. UN reports on what we had seen in Myanmar around an escalation, in this case of violence against Rohingya populations, and where, again, a kind of organization of a majoritarian population, in this case a Buddhist population, against the Rohingya Muslim minority population, operating at scale and orchestrated through national governments who were looking to social media essentially as their right-hand tool, favorite tool to be able to sort of amplify and sort of shore up majoritarian and popular support around fanning the flames of some kind of minoritized threat.
Yeah, I think you made the point that Zuckerberg, even though he was forced after that leak happened to sort of acknowledge, to issue this report and acknowledge that they needed to do better and have more content moderation in other parts of the world and stuff, still advertised, sort of bragged about the fact that winning politicians had the largest Facebook following, as though
Absolutely.
we are happy to, the dark side of it is like we are happy to be the tool that enables oftentimes despotic authoritarian ideas to disseminate broadly enough to win political coalitions.
Absolutely. I mean, Zuckerberg was featured shaking hands with Narendra Modi. Again, a sort of well-known nationalist, Hindu nationalist political leader who many human rights organizations have really critiqued for leaning into a kind of minoritarian violence and fanning the flames of minoritarian dispossession, deal making, and very happy. And the heels of all of this reporting, still quite happy to sort of re-secure the kind of prominence of Facebook as essentially the internet in India. And so the kind of alignment of Silicon Valley and sort of people might have thought that publics, U.S. reading publics, user publics, might have assumed was a sort of a nicer, kinder version of the internet tech bro, right? It's not the Google boys or the Mark Zuckerberg or even Jeff Bezos, who's not supposedly like a Peter Thiel, who has been a very staunch kind of anti-democratic institution advocate, for now well documented in almost 20 years, 2 decades of this sort of kind of underscoring of supposedly the incompatibility between Silicon Valley innovation and democratic institutions, or people like Elon Musk, with this sort of now alignment with AfD, right-wing nationalist parties in Germany, and his own kind of strange, weird salute, Nazi-like salute to audiences.
Nazi-like.
Exactly.
Nazi-like. I'm sorry. I have a friend who is so smart and who fully knows better. But after like a day or two of conservatives like claiming up and down that it wasn't a Nazi, was like, Brianna, are you sure? Like, do we think that this is a Nazi salute?
Yeah.
And I was like, girl, don't let them gaslight you. You know what you saw. Like, do not let them gaslight you. That was a Nazi salute as clear as there has ever been a Nazi salute.
Exactly.
Don't let them get you, girl.
Yeah. Yeah. Thanks for that, Brianna. No, I love it. Yeah. Thank you.
Stand firm in that one.
In any case, yeah. So the range of all of that now, right? So the whole kind of alignment that we see with Silicon Valley around the MAGAist agenda and explicitly eugenicist agenda. This isn't a right-wing turn in Silicon Valley. This is very explicitly Silicon Valley knows how it's what the impacts of its disinvestment and de-architecting of safety has been. It will now experiment with that on U.S. publics. We will certainly start to see outcomes after March when the largest social media platforms are going to start pulling, of course, and disinvesting in their own sort of safety boards and teams, and starting to allow, as they claim, a kind of better version of free speech to populate. We know what that will look like, and it is absolutely distant. They've already done that experiment. And when I say that,
I'm sorry, when you say that, I didn't mean to cut you
when
off.
you say that it's an experiment that's happening on publics over and over again, it's precisely that. It's this kind of thinking of A/B testing across. I mean, within companies, it's usually thought of as simply A/B testing. Let's see what will happen if we change or tweak this feature, whether or not it ends up with the notion normally that it's going to be something that let's see how it gets more clicks or what kind of traffic it generates. But of course, the experiments happen on a much more consequential decisions around what kinds of teams that we're going to architect altogether, whether or not it's worthwhile or profitable or not profitable. It's whether it's worth our dollars to expend on safety teams for these particular publics or not. And we know for essentially for the entire existence of Facebook, it has been one where they have not invested in any version of safety for global publics under the notion that it's simply not worth their penny, but also where there's lives essentially, and where they recognize, where it has been underscored over and over again. They have to have recognized already that this is something that actually causes lives and costs lives.
Well, I'm curious what you think we should do about that, because this is one that's been very tricky, I think, for the left. You see something like the TikTok ban that is explicitly pushed by the people that pushed it for the reason of the popularity of the pro-Palestine movement on the app, for instance. You see the limited, admittedly, but successes of movements like Black Lives Matter getting their legs on Twitter through hashtags. You see the way that the mainstream media is shut down to, left of Kamala voices, and the way that the Bernie blackout happened and how dismissive of any left politics the mainstream MSNBC, CNN are in this country. And the TikTok, Instagram, the Twitter, all of these are avenues, YouTube, for independent media to flourish, even despite the fact that we recognize that we are throttled and censored in various ways because the owners of these apps don't favor our interests. Nonetheless, they favor untraditional conservative interests, and therefore we can kind of coast off of the wake of the permissiveness that's set up for them. Mm-hmm. And so when we start to talk about censorship or any kind of safety protocols, I think that there's a legitimate concern from the left that what we're going to get is a recreation of traditional media, which was more hostile to the left than untraditional media has been. And so to find it, I think we struggle to find ourselves, we struggle to put ourselves in this position to be rooting for more censorship by entities that are 100%, whether they're liberal, mainstream conservative, mainstream Democrats, they're going to be mainstream and completely antithetical to our interests. And when you say hold people accountable, hold people responsible for acts of violence, especially out the context of American First Amendment rights, that also becomes scary. Are we going to say that because I said I like what's the shooter guy's name? Sorry, Luigi Mangione, that if the next person that gets killed, I'm rounded up and taken to jail because I said Luigi Mangione was a hero and lit a votive candle with his face on it or something, hypothetically.
Yeah. I mean, I would absolutely be worried about the way that any version of interpretation of either freedom of speech, academic freedoms, et cetera, gets interpreted
what's
by this particular administration. Absolutely.
With all the Israel stuff, yeah. And all the universities, but Harvard just had a bad week.
Exactly. No, there is no limit on the number of contradictions that this can yield. And at the end of the day, I mean, Twitter itself as its own sort of space where you've seen, of course, Musk supposedly lean into a version of free speech, but only if it's for accounts that don't criticize him. And where he will black out accounts or deprioritize accounts that have been critical of his own of his funding agenda, of his own management of X, any of that kind of exceptionalism, and that notion that the rules actually don't apply to them. I mean, that you will see any number of times on these platforms. So, and amongst this particular kind of coterie.
This gets to an important point that I really want to make sure we don't miss. Getting back to the kind of Peter Thiel of it all and what the broader project of all of this is. We mentioned the kind of alignment in goals between affluent elites and the desire not to have public spending go to the poor. And so the point of so much of this eugenics style framing as being defining this group of undeserving poor. This other piece that I found to be really interesting is your argument that this kind of that this kind of cohort, this tech-based cohort, finds democracy and freedom to be fundamentally incompatible. And this is a quote you have in here from Peter Thiel. An acknowledgement that the success of this technological economy requires an unbridled, unlimited freedom for these innovators who are supposed to be special big brain geniuses that should not be constrained by any sort of regulation. And therefore, their project is fundamentally undemocratic. And they are not shy about saying that it is undemocratic. So they have to come out with these roundabout explanations for why the public, who is fundamentally protected by democracy, that's the whole point, should give up their democratic rights and let these rich billionaire techno autocrats live. And I want to, in case you think I'm being melodramatic, I want to read this quote that you included from Peter Thiel. In an essay for the Cato Institute, he wrote, "I no longer believe that freedom and democracy are compatible." Quiet part out loud. "The future of technology is not predetermined, and we must resist the temptation of technological utopianism, the notion that technology has a momentum or will of its own, that it will guarantee a more free future. A better metaphor is that we are in a deadly race between politics and technology." Politics versus technology. Okay. "The fate of our world may depend on the effort of a single person who builds or propagates the machinery of freedom that makes the world safe for capitalism." The goal, to make the world safe for capitalism, you have to give up your freedom.
Right. Precisely. Yeah. I mean, this is when you hear Elon Musk in the kind of opening day, sort of predicting in the opening days of the Trump administration that the American public will simply have to get used to feeling a little bit more hardship. That is not by any means a kind of, I mean, that is really his prediction and his kind of warning to the American public that this sort of range of policies that I would love for Doge to be able to actually execute is going to not feel comfortable. And not just not comfortable, but it's going to be something that may actually, as we saw in the kind of non-accidental kind of canceling of federal funding to any number of different sort of programs that could be thought of as one kind of scale pause, but especially ones that impacted minoritized populations and vulnerable, including Medicare and Medicaid, right? Like kind of wholesale, even popular programs are on the block. So that is Musk really kind of again saying that this is going to require a kind of whole scale revolution on the kinds of programs in our version of what we might have thought of as given and comfortable. The notion too, I mean, so that is a kind of experiment in messaging to sort of see whether or not like what people's appetites for this thing will be. Because at the end of the day, that notion that Thiel is underscoring that he believes that democracy and capitalism are no longer compatible. I mean, that is essentially that is not anything at all. He published this with the Cato Institute back in 2009. He's been speaking publicly, essentially around this line. His funding of any number of MAGA candidates, from Peter Thiel to a whole range of obviously state-based local elections. Oh, I'm sorry, JD Vance. Thank you for the correction. To any number of local state-based elections. All of this has been part of a kind of worldview and an ideology that has driven his investments, again, not just in politics, but not just in technology, but in politics. Technology is very much a space where his own investments, I mean, again, Peter Thiel is PayPal, Palantir, the investments in Facebook. I mean, it is a kind of investor engine in and sets a kind of cultural and economic tone for other companies and startups that it is funding. He's a very, very powerful influencer in the kinds of leadership corridors of Silicon Valley. But this notion again that democracy and capitalism are not compatible for him is is quite serious.
Yeah, and I want to draw, like, I want to highlight it and draw like 15 circles around it, because I really want to be clear with this, what this is about. I'm speaking to the audience, not to you. Like, but I think on the like the left, of which I am a part, we have been engaged in a project for years of, in some ways, anticipating the backlash that is currently happening against traditional liberalism, racial inclusion, all of that stuff. By trying, and this has been my project and how I got into journalism, by trying to be clear about what we're saying. You know, I wrote early articles about the weaponization of identity politics against left candidates like Bernie Sanders, saying you can't just blindly say we're going to vote for any black candidate or any woman candidate. You got to look at the policies. You can't be racially essentialist. Saying, okay, I understand that we're uncomfortable with cultural appropriation, but is our political project being mad at Kim Kardashian for wearing cornrows, or is it for the fact that, historically marginalized populations don't have as easy access to funding, so they can't open a taco truck in the same way a white person can open a taco truck, and that seems fundamentally unfair? Like, where should our focus actually be? Like, I get the anger at the white people taco truck, but is it really at the white people, or is it about these institutional factors? And that didn't work. Nobody listened to us. They crushed Bernie, and now we're in this world where predictably you have Donald Trump back for a second term. And I think that some people on the left are scrambling for relevance to continue to say, I don't care. We're not going to talk about racism. We're not going to talk about criminal justice issues. We're going to focus on economic issues, and we're going to win back the white working class, and that's what it's going to be. And I do believe in focusing on economic issues and winning back the white working class. I don't think these things are mutually exclusive. But I think it's important to talk about this stuff because race is a huge part of the right-wing project, and failing to address it head on and rolling your eyes at everything that's like racially implicated as like quote unquote identity politics is ceding unnecessary ground, and I think is very dangerous. And this was kind of occurring to me and really coming front of mind to me as I was reading your book, Dr. Chan, I have to confess. And the echoes between what Peter Thiel says in that quote that I just read and what this fellow Simon Patton, who was a Wharton Business School economist and future American Eugenics Association president, the American Eugenics Association president. This is what he said back in 1899. Terrifyingly similar echoes, okay? He wrote, social progress is a higher law than equality, and a nation must choose it at any cost.
That's right.
Equality is not the goal. Is this not what we've been hearing from Christopher Rufo and all of these years? That you should. They talk about equity, which is a little bit of a goofy, fine, but this is what they're getting to. It's like first they come for equity, and next they come for equality, and then there was no democracy left.
Exactly.
They're saying the social progress, the idea that these smart technocrats in San Francisco are what we should perceive as social progress that's going to somehow trickle down to the rest of us as they build their spaceships to Mars and going to leave the rest behind. Social progress is a higher law than equality, and a nation must choose it at any cost. The at any cost part is the part where you take these populations that are going to be harmed by it and say they're not worth caring for, they're not worth spending money on anyway because they're inherently degenerate. Look at this IQ test, look at this criminality, look at these fingerprints, look at this the lasciviousness of 19th century Chinese immigrants. We don't have to care about them anyway. And he goes on to write, a lack of progress would eradicate the efficient and prudent as certainly as the presence of progress crushes the inefficient and thoughtless. Progress thus favors non-moral standards upheld on the one hand by concrete economic rules, harmonizing with the immediate environment, and on the other hand with intensive feelings that made men disconnected with anything short of perfection. So he explicitly says, blah, blah, blah. Progress favors non-moral standards. Forget morality. Forget equality. Trust us. We got this. The bros in San Francisco got this.
Right. It's going to look ugly. It's going to look uncomfortable. It's going to upset your moral core. But the longer arc of this, right, this is essentially the mantra. This is an old play, which is why I underscore this is an old playbook and an old mantra.
Yeah.
It's going to look ugly and it's going to upset your moral core, but in the end, progress will result. Trust us. We have predictive models for all of this.
Exactly.
Yes.
And J.D. Vance is on TV quoting the Bible as to why we shouldn't help our neighbor.
Absolutely. And
they're redefining Christianity as
exactly
capitalist.
Precisely. And the hiding of racial politics over and over again, trying to find new languages to describe what they're doing, right? So that they can sort of avoid it. Right? Like whether it's this notion of merit and saying that this is really about meritocracy, or if it's this notion that we've seen again. I mean, this is alarming to me that we see this language again of natural talent. You literally hear MAGAites making nods to this again, right? Even that this is about natural talent. That we want natural geniuses back up in office, right? All of this means to sort of speak around and get around talking about the notion that they are absolutely making an assault that is racialized, and that this is about a disinvestment, especially in trying to in the construction of a pluralistic society. Their idea for what the future of the U.S. will look like is absolutely monoculturalist. It is one that is structured around hierarchy and stratification. When you hear, I mean, this is not just again, like the corridors of MAGA, in literally in Silicon Valley, some of the most popular ideological thinkers are far right philosophers who are arguing for a return of monarchy. That the notion is, and making correlations between monarchies and CEOs, and that CEOs, if we had government being run by CEOs or by monarchists or by a monarch, we would have a much more efficient version, a much more progressive, a more progress-oriented, a much more action-oriented kind of government. The language that you'll hear over and over again is strong nation. That is absolutely eugenic code. The notion of the strong body, the fitter nation, all of this goes back to the kind of eugenic imaginary that's all sort of built around, stronger bloodlines, the right kind of breeding, the right kind of literal American body as a prototype for what the future of the nation should look like. And it is not pluralist. We should. This is why over and over again, when we think about these notions of what the imagination is for like what a merit-based society would look like, what a merit-based company would look like. These are fundamentally anti-diversity because they are anti-pluralistic. They want to essentially be able to.
They're anti-democratic. I've been thinking about this a lot. Like we like Americans are so indoctrinated about this meritocracy, individualist malarkey, and it is so hard to it's so hard to shake yourself. And this is what the Rufos and them have been doing too. There's been a lot of like good academic scholarship for years and years and years about that challenge us to shake off the notion of individual genius. This is such a huge part of my history of science education, right? That the history of progress is the history of individual genius. No, it's not. It's circumstantial and has to do with climate and resource availability and immigration trends and all these other kinds of things. And people who invented things often invented them in 10 times at the same place. Sir Francis Galton's cousin Darwin being a kind of one of those examples of simultaneously coming up with a theory of evolution. It is. And there's been so much like like Christopher Rufo style joking about some excesses in this realm, like companies. It usually happens in a corporate environment where companies take these, I think, useful academic lessons and over apply them. So they'll be saying things like timeliness is a white construct, and then everybody blows their gasket because it sounds ridiculous. But there is the reason why they're coming after a lot of this. I don't know how you would characterize this, sociological kind of reframing. Is because it is good, because it's unworking a lot of the programming about that it has enabled top-down control by groups that want to maintain that control, including buying into this idea of merit as real and meritorious and worth saving and a useful way to structure society. And because we value merit so much, it is almost invisible the extent to which it can come at the expense of democracy, not just diversity, which people these days are like, I don't give a shit. Like, I don't value democracy. So it's not that I don't value, what did I just say? Diversity. It's not that I personally don't value it, but I can recognize that like they've done a good enough job of chipping away at that. But that's not even like the point for me right now. It's not diversity that's at stake. It's democracy that's at stake. Because if you start meting out values according to your quote unquote merit, that's derived by these fake tests that some dude in 1899 came up with, or 1850, whatever, came up with, then that is an excuse. It's a justification to strip you of your inalienable rights that our founding fathers, for all of their flaws in the liberal tradition, felt like were inherent to you, or that religious traditions or whatever you want to go by that were inherent to you. And that's why it's so pernicious that you get someone like J.D. Vance quoting scripture and redefining terms to convince you that you don't have these rights, that you should be accorded value in society by what your SAT score was, because that worked for him because he went to Yale and it got him out of the ghetto.
That's right. I mean, we should keep in mind that when they say that they want a merit-based society, they don't want really a merit-based society. I mean, if we were talking about a genuine merit-based society, we would talk about, I mean, first of all, like there's a question of like merit for what, but the notion of obviously equal, like that everyone gets to be included, and a notion that everyone should be able to compete, and that talents will express differently across the spectrum, and that those different and diverse talents can all get applied. I mean, really, this is about them not actually wanting to have a genuine competition because of their own paranoia and anxiety that they actually won't bubble up, that they may actually not be the smartest guy in the room.
And that happened with the H-1B stuff, right?
Absolutely.
So I wanted to ask about this just as a wrap. I'm sorry, I know we've gone long over, but like, as you can see, you've got me really, like, everything was coming together for me. My synapses are firing. The H-1B thing, and then this OpenAI, the Chinese OpenAI thing that just happened, seem to have really exploded these expectations.
Absolutely.
And like taken the veneer off of like, oh no, this isn't a white supremacist project. This is a merit project.
Precisely. They don't want actual competition. They don't want actual competition. And part of the kind of like keeping everyone with blinders on that they are the only, is to insist that they are the only pathway to a real future, that all of their technologies and all of their kinds of predictive architectures and infrastructures have already foretold that. Don't pay attention to anything else. You don't really need to pay attention to anything else. Nothing else good will happen. I wanted to make and right, exactly. Both of the examples, the OpenAI example, Stargate example, and the H-1B visa example, is spot on with exactly those kinds of diagnostics, that at the end of the day, they're talking about kind of reshoring up resources, especially for them. This is not just about democracy, is not hateful to them, is not reviled by them only because it invests in the poor or in the undeserving as far as they can. It is about investing in taking away investments that they think should go to them. And that if everything were sort of architected around essentially shoring up whatever version of society that they believed in, then that in their own, as I describe it, a eugenic kind of remaking of society, then things would operate, of course, so much better for who, of course, is really that question. That even the notion of how they lean into merit for what, right? I mean, so again, like the kind of leaning into the language of merit always presumes that you know what that kind of version of like how to answer that question, that merit looks only one particular way, and that also whatever your metric is for measuring or ascertaining or assessing that version of value is, of course, correct, is functional, is efficacious. None of those things are actually presumed, of course, in the way that we sort of practice a version of value and participation and inclusion in a democratic sphere, but that is not what's obviously being defended for. The experiment right now is to see how much of an appetite the American public has for essentially de-architecting democratic institutions, and also just essentially shifting away from even a notion of democracy as good. When you see these articulations of the monarch would be the better, a CEO or a monarch, right? Figureheads that have no version of accountability either to a kind of construction of a pluralist society or obviously support for anyone who wasn't productive and operational for their own agenda, right? With a presumption that, of course, a CEO and a monarch would already have that kind of given model for good in their mind and could program everyone towards that orientation, and that in somehow magically in perpetuity would be good forever and ever and ever, as opposed to this kind of notion of democracy where, again, any multiplicity of ideas can actually come up and in theory, at the very least, allow some version of articulation of a kind of new future, again, to come from multiple kinds of pluralistic.
Yeah, I love that at the end. People, fans of the show, know that I'm a big Trekkie. And when you're talking about imagining different possible futures and resisting the sort of predictive algorithm for how things are going to go, I'm always thinking, I mean, I've obviously said this before. I strongly feel like having grown up on the Next Generation and futurist utopias primes me to have better expectations of the future than people who grew up with Star Wars and the bang bang dystopic laser kinds of futures. And I think my political imagination was legitimately expanded by growing up in a world where I had the expectation that by, 2300 or whatever, we were going to be in a better place. But to your point, I just want to really underscore this point you were making about how explicit this idea is of wanting to have a benevolent aristocracy. You write about, is it Goddard? Sorry, I don't know. writing, you say, you're talking about this in the context of IQ testing and the rapid rise of it. You write, the rapid expansion of an intelligence testing enterprise and the ready popularization of eugenics classification around mental fitness through the projection of economic futures and the impact on healthy populations readily demonstrated to Godard the viability of such strategies to protect the political power of the established white elite in the context of rapid global change. As importantly, it provided a means to press for a reinvention of democracy, uprooting the meaning of democratic government from conventional definitions as historically rooted, as he acknowledged, in a rebellion against a so-called aristocracy. An acknowledgement that traditional democracy is a rebellion against aristocracy. We're coming out of kings and queens, and look, we're doing French Revolution. We're doing America. This is great stuff.
Yes.
But the people are realizing, no, we don't want this to keep happening. We got to do a reversal. And go on to say, by allowing that people rule instead, by selecting the wisest, most intelligent, and most human to tell them what to do to be happy, democracy could be a method for arriving at a truly benevolent aristocracy.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, this has been part of a kind of eugenic agenda also from sort of day one, sort of imagining themselves as sort of the god players and the philosopher gods behind a kind of governing of society at scale. Galton, we forget that, Galton, of course, very famously, it needs to be stated, I didn't actually make it explicit in the beginning, that he's, of course, not just the father of the term eugenics, but also the practice of statistical regression, which is the foundation for prediction practices within data industries, AI industries, et cetera. So our big data companies, all of it is still founded on that sort of that methodology that they cultivated, again, out of an anxiety and a need to supposedly preserve and protect the fitter patrician elite classes and a kind of white supremacy that, again, he thought was under threat.
And Darwin's cousin, by the way, you say it said fitter.
Yes,
right?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, exactly.
So there's this kind of social, it's explicitly social Darwinist. It's taking these lessons from evolution and saying, no, actually, the fittest should survive, except the fittest is just the person who inherited the oils baron's money or whatever, these kind of like entrenched legacies of wealth.
Yes, exactly. But all of this is, I mean, again, this is back to your question about like, understanding this culture and why sort of looking at these sort of what I think of as really the sort of first data scientists and thinking about the parallels that they have to the sort of elite tech bros and data scientists, the kind of leaders of the movement now, very parallel kinds of movements, that they were all driven by very, very parallel anxieties, again, around their own kind of existential demise. This notion it's quite close to it. This is not a kind of picture of reality. This is what's operating in their own sort of version of again their bubble society. But when you look at the kinds of things that Galton was up to, he too was a kind of one of the things that he was working on until he passed away was also another version of sci-fi. I'm going to get the title wrong, but it essentially it ends with a version of a prediction of what a eugenic society would look like in a place that he can't say where. That's sort of again a nod to this could happen potentially anywhere. I would hope, but the whole the whole novel, the whole premise is based on the notion of a scientist getting to re-engineer a society, and that re-engineering essentially looks like scientists getting to couple the social reproduction, the biological reproduction of heterosexual couples for the kind of future betterment, and that supposedly the society would improve or had improved precisely because of this sort of design coupling from above. This was the kind of, again, conceit and self-image that you have of this patrician, endowed, but very cloistered class that, again, doesn't, when they think about, again, their entitlement to experimentation, the kind of rightness and justification of their sense of what looks like intelligence, what is fitness, how would that look like at scale, what is also unfitness, what is the thing that we supposedly want to suppress, all of that, again, sort of being congealed into a version of a mental map for them that they then can execute through the kinds of instruments and technologies that they devise and design and then popularize at scale, and then supposedly creating new knowledge infrastructures, again, to support the kind of popularization of this program and to evidence also the kind of rightness of this vision. I mean, the parallels are entirely too striking.
You're telling me that here comes Sir Francis Galton, a less successful fail cousin compared to his cousin, who goes through the Tony Parks of his town collecting data on where the hot women are, who also fantasizes about a future where the women are forced to pair with him for genetic benefit of the population. It's giving tech, bro.
Yes, it is.
Giving contemporary incel. Make them breed with me. You know, why women have sexual autonomy? I don't like it. They should be forced to breed. Reddit chat room. It's very... The more things change, the more things stay the same.
Exactly. And how the kind of data play fields could really be their kind of execution, supposedly, again, of their perfect world. I mean, really, it's pretty dark into the kinds of recesses of the psychology that we have allowed, like literal pathologies that we have empowered through various infrastructures, whether it's through well-endowed and very respected on the veneer, endowed through respected institutions, research laboratories, and infrastructures, or whether it's through the kind of getting to design national policies at scale, right? I mean, all of those things are repetitions, and it is no accident that we are seeing this kind of reaching back to a eugenic playbook. And not just the language that we're hearing repeated, right? Again, when you hear this kind of notion, when you hear Elon Musk talking about the great replacement theory, that is straight out of the pages of Madison Grant and eugenicists from a century ago. When you hear about the obsessions around natural talent and bloodlines and a merit-based society, again, all of those things are direct nods and a winking reference back to a eugenic playbook that at least part of his audience already knows. Just to say that, amongst the right wing, there has already been a kind of upswing in sales around Madison Grant publications. With
years ago, I think you mentioned this, that there was another upswing around 2016 of the Charles Murray book.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. Charles Murray and Richard Herrnstein, who were the famous authors of, for older audience members, especially, may remember the controversy in the 1990s bell curve publication that again kind of reinserted a eugenic argument around correlations of intelligence and race, and that essentially all geared around the new knowledge economy of the 1990s, and making this supposedly a benevolent argument around trying to steward a stronger economic nation, and that in order to do so, we would need to be more attendant to the notion, to the actual facts of inequality in American society, rather than trying to gear institutions around this imagined fable of equality amongst men. I mean, really, very importantly, I will also just sort of make a nod that education, because it's, again, back on the chopping block with Project 2025, and again, all the freezes in federal funding that we have seen. But for eugenicists, the education system has been a kind of core target, strategically aimed at, obviously since the turn of the century, but all the debates that we saw around funding for public education, around funding for gifted students, that supposedly funding for special ed programs, and that programs that were meant to attend to especially special students being served in urban schools, and that this was taking away funding from supposedly the gifted and the elite and the real talent, that we were supposedly allowing for an undercare of those kinds of really the most promising students. All of these were arguments that were reasserted, not during the 1990s in the bell curve when that whole controversy popped up, but they've been around since the 1960s, on the front pages of Harvard-based publications, the Harvard Business Review, essentially again trying to disguise racialized arguments under notions of economic efficiency, and that these.
Yeah, I LOL'd at that one citation. I think this is what you're alluding to, where there's some article talking about why are we trying to educate the blacks. It's never going to work. And I look at the date and it's like 4 years after the Civil Rights Act is signed. They're like, oh, well, we gave it a Girl Scout try. 400 years of slavery and 100 years of Jim Crow. But hey, look.
Yeah, it's amazing.
We tried.
I mean, yeah. It's not a coincidence by any means. Once again, that, when you heard even not too long ago, with the Republican national candidates, Vivek Ramaswamy and who were, again, big MAGA supporters, but sort of projecting what kinds of things they would put on the chopping block, that getting rid of the Department of Education, it's not just sort of a pipe dream, obviously, any longer. Like we think it sounded like a completely out of the blue statement. It was not an out of the blue statement. It is something that had precedent in prior eugenic arguments, and that still obviously has quite a bit of currency. That last point you were making was so spot on, but also deserves such a thick conversation, because there really is a kind of reinvention of the racialized politics of what MAGA is doing, of their kinds of both their attempt to recode race, again, back, making a nod, drawing from a eugenics playbook, and the means by which, really, it is a kind of radical elitism that is leaning into a majoritarian politic that is obviously picking up on white supremacy, but not just that. Which is why you see, Kash Patel and Vivek Ramaswamy and whatever, any number of different folks who are kind of
large numbers of voters that are black and brown going over to the right.
Absolutely, exactly. It is really a kind of radical elitism that is powering the kind of messaging, and also this kind of version of supposed meritocracy. That there's been this kind of unfair kind of doling out of resources that's based on this kind of old diversity version of categorization, and supposedly this kind of their version of trying to make it truly competitive. And the conceit of that, the kind of false illusion of that, why that plays out, that's a really thick conversation. But you're exactly right that it plays into, it is built on racial anxiety and a white supremacist anxiety that has never disappeared. And even when it is re-engineered or looks a little bit different around the edges, that is it at its core.
Yeah, what scares me is that I see liberals. The reason that I started writing about some of these topics, and I got a lot of blowback from liberals when I did, was because I kind of saw it. I saw the backlash coming, and I'm not saying that it could have been stopped. There's other bigger forces. But you could kind of see it coming when people got a little too comfortable during the Obama era and started saying insane shit. Just everything, just insane. So, and then stuff that makes sense in academia got pulled out into this corporate context, and then by people who didn't know how to handle it, or just saying and doing insane shit that was making good liberals uncomfortable. I won't say good liberals. It was making white liberals uncomfortable. And the politics of white liberal shame can only take you so far. And there was going to be, what concerns me is not the backlash on the right necessarily, because to your point, there's racism in that cohort that has always existed. But what terrifies me is when I hear, my last boyfriend came from an affluent white family. I remember hearing his mom, liberal, Pennsylvania, liberal. Having all of this anxiety. Her kids are grown too, obviously. I'm dating one. I was dating one. Having all of this anxiety about Vietnamese kids getting into school.
Oh, wow.
For some reason, very specifically, Vietnamese kids, very specifically focused on Vietnamese kids' test scores and how you can't compete anymore. Huh. And my ex was a PhD. He had just graduated from his PhD program when I started dating him. And he, for a second, he wanted to be a professor, but the market wasn't what it was. He was Russian literature, good luck. But there was all of this, he would never say this, but the implication on the edges of his family, listening to them talk about it, was there's no spots for you. All their spots are going to somebody who looks like me. And I'd be listening to them and I'd be like, when are you going to fucking say it? Or when are you going to fucking say it? But there's this, the generalized scarcity and the falling of the failure of, the crumbling of academia, the underfunding of academia, generally speaking, is making people lean in to these justifications. And this is something I wish I had talked about, actually. The just world hypothesis. I had this professor in law school, John Hanson, who I'm always referencing because he's my favorite. But this idea that radical change happens when your vision of the world as it is versus the vision of the world as it should be. you can't like come up with these excuses to rationalize them. The break is too big. And so then you have to have some revolutionary change. It feels almost like that's happened in reverse for the right. Like this is the right's version of, or like radical liberals going to the right. It's like they're happy as long as everything's comfortable and okay. They don't mind when you say, you know, we need to get more Black people in these positions. They're happy to support affirmative action. They're happy until it starts to implicate them. And then it crumbled. And liberals were making the arguments wrong too. It's like when I was growing up, we talked about affirmative action as you have equally qualified candidates and you pick the one that's Black or non-white or male, precisely because there is a bias that you can measure within the system already that is leading people to, between two equally qualified candidates, pick the white male one every time. Like that was part of the argument always.
Yeah,
They were
exactly.
equally qualified.
Right.
And
Unconscious bias.
Precisely because, exactly. And we talked about if you submit the same resume with different names, and one's Black hooded and one's not, like the Black one gets thrown out. We knew the statistics about how a Black person with a college degree had equal time.
This is not radical behavioral science any longer. Right. No, exactly. This is all.
But no one talks about that anymore. No one talks about the existence of actual like inequity within our system or inequality. Like I'm trying to get away from the equity.
Exactly.
And so
and what that looks like at scale, like really to imagine what that looks like at scale. You know, like
so we're having a whole conversation about Indian people and H-1B visas in Silicon Valley without a single conversation about how there's like nobody but white people in Silicon Valley. Well, there's, you know, East and South Asian Silicon Valley, but you know what I mean? How overwhelmingly white it is. Or this helicopter, God knows we're going to find out what happened with the helicopter. I don't know. Nobody knows yet, I think. I haven't looked today. But, you know, we're talking about, they want more Black people, women, whatever, flying helicopters. Are we going to have a single citation of what percent of the Air Force is
exactly? It's not actually possible. Male? Exactly. That's exactly right. Right. And even precisely.
And there's no question of like, okay, do you think it is because of merit that 99.9% of helicopter flyers in America are white male?
Why, Brianna, I mean, like every economist that was looking obviously at like these projections of like 2020 Project 2025 and like, you know, in application, it was like, they were like, this looks devastating. Like you can't run an economy based on this version of like monoculturing. And it's not, I mean, like literally like there are very few systems that you can argue if you build that out at scale around the monoculture, like how stable will that be in the longer run for certain within the corridors of Silicon Valley, where you have this like conditioned elite who are so, I mean, they've racked up billions and they have been growing gradually. I mean, you know, Elon Musk was making investments in PayPal since 1990s. So his like version of like self-righteousness is thick. It is built obviously on the Emerald Mines based wealth of his father. This is not like self-made, whatever, genius, but he will, you know, again, like rest on those laurels. But this notion, like this small coterie of folks that are really, really have no other version of models for thinking about like why pluralism is necessary, like how you actually want that in a system that's going to last. I mean, any biological system will collapse if there is that version of monoculturing and like programming from above, because that's what they're essentially making an argument for. Like if you can just get everyone to fall in line and like, again, they'll racialize it, but really what they're talking about is exactly that, a kind of remaking around this kind of whatever beautiful white utopia. Even if you were to do that, at the end of the day, at some point, like you are really divesting in some version of actual pluralistic creativity and intellectual whatever, you know, development.
Yeah, they don't care. They're monopolists.
Exactly. It's really it's only about a survivalist program. And the more you collapse everything else such that like resources can get channeled to them, I mean, it does become like the survival of them means the survival of the future, because it's like everyone else has become like so disinvested in that there is no
and quite literally they're gonna burn the planet down.
Precisely.
So many seats to Mars.
Exactly. And exactly with the kind of Stargate argument. I mean, it is so dark and cynical, the notion of the amount of energy they would need to be able to remake an AI economy. So essentially you could have whatever your Fortune 500 companies profiting, but essentially labor getting disrupted at scale. Right. I mean, like a disemployment of populations, and essentially like what they're already planning for is sort of a workers' revolution. I mean, this is why they're building out it's not like a pipe. It's not. It sounds like it's out of a sci-fi novel, but they are building out their survivalist bunkers and fantasizing about getting to defect to Mars, remade to support, whatever, the survival of the elite. This is their escape plan. Like that's because I mean, it's not just going to be Luigi Mangione. Luigi Mangione is just the tip of the iceberg, and everyone's already, like irate over social media now. It's going to look like a real crap storm in another literally 3 months. Anyway, so I don't know. It's not so sorry. Well, I mean, they're pulling the plugs essentially on safety. It looks terrible now, Brianna.
I know. You're not wrong. I mean, you're not wrong. I mean, I don't know what the time scale of it all is going to be. I mean, I found myself having this fantasy when I was reading the book of whenever I get overwhelmed by how dire everything is and what it will take to stop it, I just start imagining, I was imagining, do you ever watch that movie, Us, the
oh yeah, the sci-fi
Jordan Peele, yeah. And at the end, all of the I guess they're monsters or whatever, but they're holding hands across America. I'm imagining that, but in a good way.
Exactly.
Millions of Americans just converging on oil pipelines and the homes of various elites, just throwing our bodies at the problem.
It is something like that. It is about finding another language for solidarity making. It is exactly that. Yeah. Figuring out another way to actually recognize that they're talking about all of us. When you have a eugenic agenda that classifies and lumps everybody, immigrants, the disabled, alcoholics, they're all in the same, black and brown folks.
Italians.
Right. Yeah, exactly. It's they're talking about you too. This is not some narrow, oh yeah, they'll just start with those guys. And it's ridiculously broad. Political dissenters, it's what? You're going to,
yeah, I wish I had said that. I wish we had said that too, because part of what's so absurd about it, I've had the experience when in explaining that something is racist to someone where they don't get it until I substitute a person that they don't actually think is inferior. Because people have so much encoded, no, I actually do think that doesn't sound wrong to me because I do think Black people are intellectually inferior. But then if I plug in Polish, Italian, this happened to me once in law school where I heard the South Asian guy at a table behind me. There was the fiasco that I alluded to earlier, the Stephanie Grace thing that happened, saying I don't understand why it's bad. And then I was I read the exact sentence that this student had written in an email, this racist sentence, and just put in Indian instead of Black. And suddenly he got it. And I was you motherfucker. Yeah. But yeah, I think, that is part of this whole issue on the left, where I think part of why, in good faith, a lot of people have stepped away from racial discussion is because there are ways in which it can become anti-solidaristic. There are ways that liberal elites have used a kind of politics of racial division, the same way that conservatives do in a racist way, liberals will do in a I support you and you and you and you factionally, but we're saying we're going to fight for your identitarian rights, but ignore your shared economic rights, right? So there's this you see this in picking certain candidates over others, pitting, Elizabeth Warren against Bernie Sanders, all of this kind of thing. So there's a real hesitation on the left for leaning into that.
Yeah.
But if they're going to be so explicitly racist, I'm a big Twitter person. It's my social media of choice. I built my largest following on Twitter. It represents a lot of
a version of what
work. I've put in a lot of work, man hours over the years.
Absolutely. Cultivating, exactly, a network.
Yes. And it's a part of my value, in terms of if I want to publish a book or something, it's literally intellectual property for me. It's very valuable for me and my brand.
So you're not for me
to walk away.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So you're not bridging.
I mean, I can try, but
it's not
I've been on Twitter for, since 2015. I have almost 500,000 followers. It's not going to replicate somewhere else. It's just not going to happen.
Yeah. And the communication channels are really different. Yeah.
And my network, and he's messing with the algorithm. You can no longer do searches, which is very annoying. But the archive of my own tweets and things I've said and the engagement that I've had is invaluable to me. So that being said, I am struggling to even go on Twitter these days because of Elon Musk. And I'm not fragile. I'm not a sensitive person, but I cannot bear the obviousness of what he's doing, and everyone just letting him do it because they're so ill-equipped to have the language to push back in a way that sounds informed and historically rooted as opposed to just histrionic. Because if you're histrionic, they exploit it. Look at he did a literal Nazi salute.
Yeah.
And he's trying to be like, oh, JK, you're an idiot for thinking that was a Nazi salute. So imagine
No, and then he goes to speak to the AFD
gaslighting
afterwards. Yeah. I mean, there's no
100%.
question. Yeah.
So imagine the gaslighting when you start to try to make an argument in an unsophisticated way about how he's doing eugenics and how this is white supremacy. They just laugh you off the stage.
That's not, I mean, I think there is a portion of that right now. They may laugh you off the stage, but there is a portion of them that absolutely know what they're doing. I mean, like Musk.
Well, they know.
They
Everyone knows he did a
absolutely
Nazi
know.
salute too. But I'm saying like they have successfully like memeified and like, oh, LOL, I'm just trying to trigger the libs themselves. Like, oh, we're at a point where you do a Nazi salute, do an actual swastika, and it's like, oh, it's just a joke, right? And they just accuse you of being like, because it's like the boy who cried wolf. Liberals did do a little bit of calling everybody under the sun racist, and so then it lost its power. So that's what they just accuse you of. So I just feel like you have to be so prepared for battle. And I don't think the mainstream liberals are prepared for battle.
Yeah, we're not. And in general, I think, we're sort of, I think we did a terrible job of being able to translate what any kinds of gains had been. I mean, I think there's a lot of conversation around like what it means to actually communicate some version of like, and I'm like not even, gains under a single administration, but like really like translating like the infrastructures of like civic sustainability, of social services, of social welfare.
Yes.
Like, why is it that all of us are beneficiaries of this? This is not like a single, like your taxpayer dollars are like investing in this thing so that, whatever, somebody else, supposedly can benefit from this thing. And you just get to, I don't know, whatever, go drive your Lexus. So it is absolutely something that is sustaining everybody.
Yes.
Like
But
it is
that's why
not
universal
like
programs are so important, and why like Democrats have abdicated their political responsibility and making the case for why things should be universal, because they're more difficult to tear down. They've reversed the Medicare Medicaid stuff precisely for that reason. I think they realize. I think your point about test casing, the test case,
the A/B testing, yeah,
A/B testing, exactly, is right, and they're like, whoopsie with that one for now.
Yeah, I mean, they've been doing this. This is like the normal protocol in any tech company. They just constantly A/B test. That's their whole logic all day. And none of their engineers they have no training in like what social accountability should be, on like what research accountability normally looks like. If you mention IRB to them, like every researcher at Harvard, even if you're just, collecting ethnographic data, everyone has to go through some version of like research accountability, such that if you collect data in some way that is either in violation of a kind of ethical code or that looks non-consentful, like someone's got a place to get the complaint to. Absolutely not. Non-consentful data is already by default like what their like little click when you use the platform. It's like, I consent for you to do essentially your version of constant A/B testing on me. And like that's, I mean, like to just imagine like what that psychology is when you teach engineers that from like day one. And we're not just talking about, once upon a time, this was like software, like Microsoft Word, right? It would be like whatever, your, 2 billion users across the planet, like for Microsoft Word's imaginary, but whatever, like their capture of that amount of the market, right? And like that's who you're responsible for, and that was it. And if the program failed, it failed and whatnot. But like your version of testing actually cycled through, or experimentation on publics just cycled through that version of like software release every year. This is not the kind of version of like audience testing, user testing that we get to see happen now, and that software engineers get to practice on a regular basis. And there is everything is jammed into one ethics class, and the ethics class essentially just follows like, what are we legally accountable for? So if there is nothing in place that says that actually like a version of harm, right? I mean, even like the Hippocratic Oath, it's kind of silly, but at the very least, there is a notion that like from medical practitioners that like what I do matters and implicates me in the lives of the people that I touch. Like what I do matters, like knowledge has like visceral implications. It's not just like, okay, anyway, sorry, but yeah.
There's been a bunch of, similarly, I think the Hippocratic Oath is more, I don't know, binding and relevant than the like oath that you take when you go work for the government, I guess. But there's been a bunch of people recently who have been like rebelling against, they're trying to force people to take these payouts and leave their government posts. And a bunch of people have been like like, yeah, I thought this was kind of corny and didn't take it that seriously. But even like taking my allegiance to uphold our government against, enemies, foreign and domestic, like people are feeling empowered by these sorts of things. There's like this kind of basic training to like push back in ways they might otherwise not have felt empowered to push back. So I do think that sort of thing is relevant. That sort of trading is relevant, even if it seems kind of pro forma in times when there's not crisis.
We all rely on it. And the notion that like, infrastructures can just sort of operate according to like some version of like pure business efficiency, and that we funded this thing that essentially is just like whatever, like government infrastructures as a way to just sort of like fund the undeserving, right? Like that's their notion. Like it's just keeping the undeserving, like operating over and over. It's making America weaker. It's keeping us from being the strong nation that we really could be if we just invested in the proper, like all of that, again, is like deeply racialized code. But yeah, also like,
that collateral damage aspect. Yeah. The way that collateral damage was described in a business perspective, but then translated into a human, like when the collateral is human beings, as opposed to like
neoliberalized everything. This is a long going trend, obviously, since, at least the 1970s, but the notion that we have essentially neoliberalized a version of government services and made that the kind of natural default logic. We are watching the kind of outcome of that now, because people don't have another logic to go back to other than neoliberalist logic. They don't know how to understand infrastructure around them. They just don't have any. Like we have evacuated any kind of notion of like whatever, even the most basic civic literacy, like we just don't have a way of translating that or whatever. We haven't been doing that.
We haven't been doing it. And that's intentional, right? To your the attacks on education point, like all of that's intentional. Attacks on free public college, post-integrate, like all of that is very intentional. But that's why I'm so not joking when I talk about Star Trek. Like people can have this intrinsic feeling that something's off. Like their just world hypothesis stuff is like feeling like not resonant, but you need a scaffolding to project. Like you need a scaffolding to enable you to articulate an alternative.
Exactly. And you need to be able to see yourself, not just like as individual consumer user. Like what are the things that how do people translate their everyday experience, especially now around technology? It's just as a user, like constantly user. It's a very neoliberalized way of like understanding like the individual's whatever, like existence in space. But we've essentially collapsed everything into some version of economic being, whether it's user or like, free market individual or worker or whatever it is, without underscoring any version of like social infrastructural reliance, of like a version of like whatever. What if you're an STS person, like in like pluralistic interconnectedness, like essentially our fundamental embeddedness and reliance on all of these systems that keep us all not just sort of like these individual like operating like Homo economicus ideal beings, right? But like something beyond just like our economic
community.
Yeah, exactly. We have even evacuated that, so that essentially like when we reference it, like people just have a sort of like they think not as a complex thing. They just think of it as this like cozy thing. It's like community is freaking complex. Like it is really hard to build community. What communities are you genuinely invested in? Like how do you spend your time there? And like what do you do to reinvest to make sure that those things are operating, that they like to hang together as like pluralistic networks, because communities are not all homogenous, and like whatever it means for them to hang together, it's like they've got to constantly reproduce themselves. Our parlance for talking about any of these things and our throwaways for thinking about any version of collective life as just sort of like simple and taken for grantedness, including community. I think that was really a kind of myth, whatever, our own leaning into neoliberalization, like as progressives, as whatever. So,
and this is why I'm worried about, the Dems' ability to get us out of it, because I'm reading this book and I'm thinking, oh, there's so many messaging opportunities here. Like the fact that all of these people who are now running our government are explicitly saying that they're anti-democracy. Like I fully appreciate, I know I'm like talking out of both sides of my mouth here, but like I fully appreciate like Elon Musk is a racist and an anti-Semite, which I think is true. But in conjunction with that, can we also do like, here's a literal quote from Peter Thiel, who got J.D. Vance elected, saying he doesn't believe that a democracy is compatible with like him being successful. Like, can we just like read what they said and put that in an ad and like jam that out to millions of Americans? Like they're literally saying they want you to give up your democracy and trust that they got this on lock, that if they just make their little techno bubble big enough that it's somehow going to make the price of your eggs lesser, at the same time that they're defining you out of political relevance by saying that if you're poor by default, you're undeserving poor.
That's right. That's right. The problem, I think, and the experiment that's happening right now, Brianna, is to actually measure the public's appetite and resistance, and like basically like their own kind of like frustration with democracy enough such that they too can kind of sign on like, yeah, maybe I'm not into democracy anymore. That is the messaging that's happening, like pushing the card further and further so that like it doesn't, like this notion, we kind of saw it that we already got one A/B test like through the election, right? Like that it wasn't like people didn't vote for democracy essentially, right? That messaging.
But the problem with that, Dr. Chan, is it's again, like it is an A/B test, but I feel like it's like a little bit more like of a BB test because of the poor front the Democrats put up and how radicalized people were by Gaza. Like we didn't actually have a choice. It's like this fascism or that fascism.
Sure. Right. Yeah, you could any of those things, but at the end of the day, it's still at the very least, at least one major line of messaging was whether or not you were going to vote for the Democratic candidate, the candidate that believed in democracy and the one that was promising, or at least projecting that we may now have another election, and that had been convicted of like more than 30 felonies through your largest public prosecutor's office, like government, right? And like, do you lean into that or not?
I would challenge Democrats to question whether or not the election demonstrated a lack of commitment to democracy or an acquiescence to a belief or an embrace of a belief that democracy is already over.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter.
Right, exactly. There is a question mark exactly on that thing. And wherever you lie on that spectrum, because you were only given two options, that notion of like, the question is, will you vote for democracy? Like that's what they want to gauge. And whether it's like a little bit of disillusionment or already like, it's been a long time over. I haven't seen the fruits of this thing for a long time, right? Like that's like if a version and trying to translate in people's minds that what democracy has essentially meant is like an overinvestment in these faulty, unmeritocratic DEIA trans rights, agenda that is irrelevant to everybody else. Right. And that in some ways, actually, that they're the more democratic ones, but like they don't even need to use that language anymore. Like they're promising like something else more efficient. Anyway, yeah. So we'll see what
Dr. Chan, this section has been really rich too. I mean, this is already a long episode, but if I were to want to release this like post chat section as like a bonus, how would you feel about that? Do you feel like you've said anything that you wouldn't want to say?
Oh, no, I don't think I said anything. I think we just talked like we're still on part of the podcast. I don't think I said anything. I mean, you can gauge if there's something. I mean, I've had some people that have been a little bit worried about, sorry about the, Nazi-like salute. I've had some people that are just like a little worried about where, I'm glad that you're not one of those folks, but I've had some interviewers that have been flat, like just worried about like what it will mean for them to have to be implicated and potentially be on.
Who was it? There was like a CNN or MSNBC journalist who criticized it as a Nazi salute and then was fired for it.
Oh, wow. Well, I didn't hear about that.
But mainstream liberal journalist who like tweeted something like factual, frankly, about how she disagreed with it. And there was this isn't our editorial standards, blah, 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 blah.
Wow. That's freaking crazy. But not, I mean, I don't know if it's crazy, like given
CBS.
After what we've seen. Wow.
A weather reporter, poor thing.
Oh my gosh. Was this like a local news? Was it in, what city was this in?
Milwaukee TV weather forecaster was dropped by her station one day after she criticized Elon Musk on social media for his straight arm gesture that many have likened to a Nazi salute.
Wow, that is soft language. Okay, wow. This was prior to all of this, actually, like where I had someone in this kind of conversation was just sort of like letting me know that she was a little nervous. And I was like, I totally, I don't not get it. So anyway, but yes, like I'm glad that that's not like the context of this conversation. And in general, I
No.
think it's, we've got to, I mean, like, I think we should need to continue to call it like it is. Exactly. Yeah. And not to try and
I'll soft pedal a lot of stuff. I'll not make excuses, but like I will be nuanced about a lot of stuff. And people have been mad at me for being nuanced about a lot of stuff over the years. I'm sorry. This is one of those, to quote Oliver Wendell, was it Oliver Wendell Holmes? To quote Oliver Wendell Holmes again.
Oh no.
I know pornography when I see it.
Oh, no.
I know a Nazi salute. I'm sorry. I know a Nazi salute when I see it.
Yeah. Again, like, their own like little, but like, who do they think that's going to play to? I mean, even that like weird, anyway, I'm just like their own mind, like how much of the sort of like self-conceit and like inward looking and just like self-aggrandizement that happens in that moment when they're on stage, and like to not be self-conscious at all, that you are making it obvious. I know you're already reading them. There is no question that all of this language, like great replacement theory, natural geniuses, all this shit is coming straight from the eugenicists. And it's like, okay, you just made it really explicit, like who you were just in dialogue with in your mind. Anyway, so just to say that, I mean, I think that they hope that like they can eventually push the agenda far enough that it's not going to be controversial to call them eugenicists.
I'm going to send you a clip I did when I was still co-hosting this morning show, Rising, which is one of the examples of when people got mad at me for allegedly like pussyfooting around whether or not something was racist. But I took on the great replacement theory in Tucker Carlson, one of his monologues like years ago. And I understood that like this is what they do. Like you can't just call something racist unless it's so explicit, right? Like in this environment, you got to really have a tight case. So I think you might appreciate it because I go back, if I recall correctly, and use like actual, like the Chinese Exclusion Act and all these immigration laws to make the case for even why what Tucker Carlson says isn't necessarily like racialized on its face. If you parse his language, the only explanation that would distinguish the populations that he wants versus doesn't want is in fact a racial one. And in the comments of that video, like they hate my gut. It was like a left-right show. My co-host was libertarian. And mostly they hated my guts over there. But I won a lot of people over because I made a very measured argument that was like historically rooted. And it's hard. It was like, it took time. And I think that's what we're going to have to do. Like
completely.
I can't do it alone.
Yeah.
So people need to like learn the stuff. And that's why I think you're so valuable. Like I just want to say it again. By the way, not that I'm in the position to be giving anybody, especially someone as accomplished as yourself, any advice. But like, I feel like this is so much of what's in here is important for the moment. Like my personal view is that if you were to write an article that really picked up on like that Peter Thiel quote, there was a Mark Andreessen one that was like similar that didn't manage to get in there. Comparing it to
such a good reader,
one.
Brianna. You are such a. How do you have time? I love it. I mean, like honestly, you're such a wonderful.
Just a podcaster.
No, but you're a really good reader for all of this compressed. Like to have to force all of like you are great at like at recall, at a version of like picking up. I mean, it's a very layered. Well, whatever. You did great. You are just. It's amazing. Yeah. Well, you retained all of it and put it all together, and also that's. But the Mark Andreessen quote, the Peter Theil quote.
I appreciate it. I try to earn my keep a little bit here. There was another. Oh yeah. Okay. Those two, and then like the antecedents, like the historical versions of them that showed those parallels that we talked about, and then like really making like the really explicit, clear case that like this is what they're doing. So like obviously a lot of the book is a lot of the other historical examples for like how it operated in the past. And I think that obviously like knowledge of that is useful in supporting the argument and is necessary. Yeah. But like the bits that are really like how anti-democratic this project is and how the purpose of it is to define out increasingly large sections of the population as undeserving of any kind of social safety net. And that it's coming for you too eventually. It's not exclusively racialized. And I think the examples of the Ellis Island and the white people getting implicated in that is very useful for a white audience who otherwise might not be sympathetic. And then the bigger point about how like they're explicitly saying like there is a conflict of interest between their capitalist project, their like business project, and democracy itself, and how they're going for this like benevolent aristocracy.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, yeah.
Like
Right,
that is
exactly.
an article that I want to read. The Atlantic with its racist self will publish every right wing, you know, things since its time immemorial. But I would love to be reading that in like New York Mag, The Atlantic. And if for some reason someone doesn't want to publish it, I do have some influence with like lefty magazines like Current Affairs or Jacobin or The Intercept. Like those are just who I happen to have, or Drop Site. Like that's who I happen to have friends with, be friends
Yeah,
with.
that's awesome. Yeah, that's a really great. I mean, I love that suggestion, and yeah, I might take you up on it. That's really, really wonderful. Who do you know who to reach out to? I am not someone who is practiced at writing these editorials, but I agree that I've been really frustrated with this sort of like, oh, this is just a right wing turn, like it just
Yeah.
happened overnight. It's like this is not happened overnight. This has been a project in the making, and also
Yeah.
this kind of just like, oh, this is just about good business. Like they are going to take over all of these infrastructures essentially so that they can, you know, they may have conflicts of interest, but they're essentially going to be gearing all of these resources towards their own companies, at least
Yes.
with the kind of underscore being like, at least you thinking like, oh, well, the average reader thinking like, oh, well, at least these are going to be efficient companies that are being funded. Maybe I can live with that. You know, like it's like, this is not the program. I mean, some version of that can happen and like certainly will happen, but the larger stake is not just about funneling resources to their own profit making engines. This is more also about creating those funnels by figuring out where the efficiencies and inefficiencies have lied, and it includes essentially metricizing some version of who counts as productive and who doesn't,
Yes.
who counts as more wasteful and who doesn't. And this
Yes.
is why questions of like Medicare and Medicaid, like all of like that is it's not a joke.
Yes.
It seems
100%.
extremely radical. It is like let's
100%.
see.
And like, not again, like not that I'm the be all end all of what makes for good like popular culture editorial content, but like there were parts of this where I wrote down like just wrote Doge. Like this is Doge. They tried Doge before.
Yes.
They did Doge. They're doing Doge again. Like drawing those parallels, I think, is what's gonna really excite people. Now, like there's like a cost benefit in terms of like who do you want the most eyes on it versus editorial judgment. Editorial judgment, I have so much respect for the argumentative ability and writing capacity of Nathan Robinson at Current Affairs. Like I've done some of my best writing for that magazine because I think he's just a terrific editor that just really gets it.
Oh, nice. Great.
And
Okay.
because he's a lawyer also, like he has that kind of like argumentative writing style down pat that I think is just like makes for great op-eds.
Yeah, that's awesome.
So-
Yeah.
And he's also just a friend. I used to write for the magazine, and it would be very easy for me to put you two in touch, and I would just really trust him to understand the vision.
Brianna, that'd be awesome. I mean, I don't know this kind of editor, and you can see that like one of the things, I mean, I write like an academic, and so like getting some pointers for how to translate that, even this like little map that you just gave me of like what are the kinds of salient points that like really stick out for messaging is really helpful. So if Nathan does that magic too, that's amazing. That's great. Yeah.
He's like 5 times better at it than I am. Like he's prolific, and like I have so much admiration for him. So I'll put you two in touch. I'll do it when the episode comes out, and I'll send the episode along to help give him a better understanding of sort of what the arguments are as well, I think. So in case he doesn't have time to read the whole book before making the decision.
Yeah. Did we get you, did Jess or anybody get you the media kit also? There's like a 4-page media kit that like also breaks. I think there's like a short, there's a model Q&A. That's what it is in it. That's like
could be
6 pages long. No, your script is much better. Your
like
questions are much more
nose deep.
interesting. Yeah.
Committed
But
to
like,
speed reading through this up until like about an hour before we recorded.
oh wow, well done, Brianna. Oh my gosh, I am so
Here's the thing about me and my procrastination,
history of
and
science, man.
self-diagnosed autism, or ADHD. I know how long it takes for me to do something, which becomes perversely a procrastination tool. So I always end up doing it right up to the, like in college, I knew that I could write a single space page in an hour, right? So if I have a 20-page paper due on Monday, I know that if I write 10 hours a day on Saturday and Sunday, 5 hours a day on Saturday and Sunday, single space,
That's
that I can get to my
amazing.
20-page double-spaced paper.
Yeah.
Assuming I've done the
Wow.
research already.
Yeah, right.
So like that means
Well,
I'm
that's the
turning
hard
this
part.
paper.
That is the hard part.
The
It's sort
last
of like
minute.
translating that into ideas and actually something that's worth
Yes.
putting down on paper is like the other
100%.
part. But if you already know and like have been practiced at that part, like I mean,
And I
these
know how
questions
fast
are
I can
great.
read.
Yeah, this was super interesting. I love the conversation. Yeah.
Me too. And just figuring out just like, what is the part that we need to focus on? Because I have had the thing. I used to do this a lot when I started this. I would read. I would have this like compulsion to like tell the entire story of the entire book on the podcast.
Yeah, exactly.
Which you can't do, obviously, in an hour. And I would get overwhelmed. And I like have slowly learned. I used to do this as an academic as well. Like I would pick theses that were too broad. I would like, ugh. And eventually I've come to finally at 40 years old to like get to a place where I realize that specificity is my friend and narrowness is my friend.
That's really nice.
One argument.
Needs to be on
But
a
it's tough.
t-shirt.
It's a constant battle with myself. And I haven't written myself in a while because of this. Like, I feel like I have too much to say.
But
It's
an
a
art.
struggle.
It's an art. I mean, I also think that like a lot of this is really about again, like the kind of politics of like, how do you message around this thing and actually like diagnose the evidence is like everywhere. And also it's been such a long-standing project, but also, I mean, like what, as progressives, like our own kind of messaging tactics that have not been really working for like the last, I don't know, one could argue since the 1970s that we have been failing at this slowly and that it took a really big nosedive again. But that this is not also like a project that happened like overnight, that there's something about our inability to like connect with broader.
That's what we do here. Like that is the articulated goal of this podcast is to deal with the messaging issues on the left. But I will say also that your point about the neoliberalization starting in the 70s, I think those things are not unrelated. And the diagnosis, I'm not sure if you've read like Listen Liberal by Thomas Frank, but like his diagnosis, I think, is so correct that it's basically like we rely in the two-party system for the Democratic Party to do that messaging and provide that pushback.
Yeah,
but
right.
When you have the neoliberalization of both parties and there is a submission to taking these corporate donors and playing that sort of game, then it's not like a messaging issue. Like the Democratic Party doesn't want to do Medicare for all. Like they don't want to talk about it. They don't want to do it because their donors don't want them to do it. So there's no countervailing for like the interests of the right or more are ideologically aligned with capital. The interests of the left are not. The interests of the liberals are. And so the fact that we don't have a genuinely independent left party that is not neoliberalized means that there's literally no fight. And you can't really expect there to be a fight. And the Democratic Party spends more time fighting the left and left insurgencies, as evidenced by the squad members they kicked out, the Bernie Sanders movements they quashed, all of that, than they do the right.
Yeah, and it allowed and opened this window also for much more radical experimentation from the right, where it was like, if these basically look like non-choices, let me go on a little bit on the fringe. Something needs to be, and let's just see who comes along with me. And it doesn't need to be everybody. It just needs to be a little bit more. And like that much frustration.
A bunch of us stay home. They don't need to make, many of us vote for the right. They just need to demoralize us with the genocide. And, and then that's all it takes.
Yeah, exactly. And also complications and a lack of being able to actually see and translate like in any way, like our interconnectedness with like global supply chains, with global infrastructures, with other global economies, and like not really having an understanding of like why we may have an obligation as a colonial power to actually restabilizing and actually investing in other and letting those coffers be governed by other nations. Like this isn't just like a dole out and a handout. This is actually to undo damage we have done.
Yes, 100%. Yeah, look, Dr. Chan, I have really, I'm like depressed by this conversation, but like really enjoyed, frankly, intellectually this conversation. And I think for me, it helped to clarify what's going on in this moment and what sort of the left's focus should be as we push back. And I think it makes me feel empowered. I will acknowledge that I have felt sort of cowed in my conversations about race of late because of this, what I feel like are some pervasive sentiments on the like left, that an over focus on some of these issues is what made the center left, the Democrats, vulnerable to the attacks that are now like destroying the country. But I do think when I look at the pattern of what the Christopher Rufos of the world have been going after, I think sometimes the left can confuse them attacking something because it makes us look goofy versus sometimes they attack something that makes them vulnerable. The kinds of arguments that they have historically been vulnerable to. And we have to learn to identify the difference and pick and not forgo every battle, abdicate every battle that has a relationship to race.
Yes.
And I think if we do that, if we completely cede this ground, we're going to end up in a world where they're normalizing Nazi salutes. They're normalizing outright racism. And we're in a place where most people don't think those things are good. But there has been a lack of education as to why. And I remember having this experience in law school. There were a couple of pseudo-national controversies around race that sprung up when I was there. And I remember well-meaning classmates of mine coming up to me and being like, oh, I know this is supposed to be bad, but can you help me understand why this is racist? And I do think that this kind of early aughts, maybe 90s kind of knee jerk, we had won the culture war and you just say things are racist and you walk away and nobody knows how to explain themselves and nobody knows history and nobody knows how to articulate what exactly is the evidence for discrimination. It got us to a point where people were making weak sauce, silly arguments that were easily exploited by the right and calling things racist that weren't in some cases and having this sort of overreach. And the answer to that isn't backing away from talking about this legacy of discrimination and eugenics and racism. It is understanding it enough to make the compelling argument. And I appreciate this book so much for helping me to be able to put that into words and to help me make a compelling argument. And I strongly recommend it. Predatory Data, Eugenics, and Big Tech, and Our Fight for an Independent Future. Dr. Chan, tell the audience where they can find your book and more of your work on the internet and beyond.
You can find it at your local bookstores, online, at any of your favorite booksellers. I support going to bookshop.org, which will connect you back to your local bookshops. It was published out of University of California Press. There is a free version and an open access version online for folks for whom access, that kind of access is really important. I encourage you to, be able to find it online in any of those versions.
Thank you, Dr. Chan. PSA, everyone should be a history or science major. Just putting it out there. If you've already gone to college, that sucks, I guess, but tell your kids to be history or science majors. It's the best major. You learn so much. It deeply informs your view of the world.
Absolutely. Exactly. I love it. Brianna, this is so much fun.
Thank you. I hope you can tell how much I'm geeking out and really enjoying it. And there's so much more we have gotten into. So that's why I do encourage people to go back and read the book. And maybe we can have you on sometime in the future because I don't think these issues are going away anytime soon. So thank you again.
Thank you as well, Brianna, for all the work you're doing and you and your team. It's wonderful.
Thank you. Thanks to the audience for tuning in this week and subscribing and supporting this podcast. As always, take care of yourselves and remember to keep the faith.